Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm John Bitson. I'm the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to AI Connect. I'm excited today that we're talking about artificial intelligence and its implications for society. The Challey Institute is dedicated to trying to find ways to increase opportunity and flourishing and enable human progress. And when we think about all the advancements that have occurred in artificial intelligence recently and that are continuing to occur, it's hard to talk about the future progress without talking about artificial intelligence. So I think this is a very appropriate theme for our event today. I think it's funny that we think about artificial intelligence as being something really new. And I know I'm going to get corrected by our speakers on my inaccuracies on this part, but as far as I understand it, the birth of artificial intelligence, or the idea of artificial intelligence, has been attributed to Alan Turing in 1950 when he asked the question, can machines think? And he developed something called the Turing test. And the Turing test was a way, and it was a thought experiment, but the idea was to go ahead and try for people to interact with machines or computers and interact with people. And then if they couldn't tell if they were interacting with a computer or not, then the computer would essentially be intelligent. And so that was kind of the idea. And I think in 1997, a big event occurred that made a lot of people aware of the potential of artificial intelligence in terms of strategic thinking and solving complex problems. Anyone know who Garry Kasparov is? So the world chess champion. And so remember that Deep Blue, IBM's supercomputer, defeated Garry Kasparov in a chess competition. So that was at one time thought that that was not possible, that a computer could beat a human in chess. And so that was a big event. And then in 2022, OpenAI introduced ChatGPT to the general public. And then people saw the ability of artificial intelligence to generate content. And then I think since then, everyone has really talked about artificial intelligence. I mean, you hear it on a daily basis. I think everybody does. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that there's a lot of ways that we use artificial intelligence in our everyday lives, and we have been using them. So if you text and you have an autocorrect on your text, that's artificial intelligence. When you use Google Maps to get here, okay, I know Bob lives like a block away and used probably artificial intelligence to get here this morning. You used Google Maps to get here. Or if you use Google something, or even streaming Pandora, and it picks a selection of songs that you're likely to like. Just a wide variety of things in our everyday lives. Or if you interact with customer service with a company, or think about manufacturing companies that have used robotics and artificial intelligence for a long time as well. But I think it's the promise of artificial intelligence and propelling future progress that really excites me. And so think about things like developing new drugs that are going to cure illnesses much more rapidly and at a much lower cost. Or think about the ability of artificial intelligence right now to diagnose more accurately than doctors can illnesses. And so those are really exciting. Or think about the ability to travel more safely and more quickly through autonomous vehicles, or businesses that are going to be able to use and still already are using artificial intelligence to improve their business processes, increase their productivity, reduce their costs. Or think about just the acceleration of innovation that is going to happen and already has happened. And I think the big issues that we think about, so think about climate change, for example. I think eventually artificial intelligence may, okay, I mean, this is my thought, it may come up with a solution, you know, a technological solution. And so it's exciting to think about the future. But despite the promise of artificial intelligence, many people have concerns about artificial intelligence. So people are concerned about job loss, and Revana is going to talk about that this morning. So people are concerned that certain types of jobs may be eliminated. Also, there's concerns maybe of different types of training that people might need in order to adjust to artificial intelligence. Concerns about deep fakes and misinformation, concerns about biases, concerns about privacy. So there are a variety of legitimate concerns about artificial intelligence as well. So I think it's a great time to talk about AI, how it can fuel human progress, and how we can address various concerns. So today we're going to talk about the promise of AI, the potential of AI. We'll talk about addressing various concerns without thwarting the innovative potential of artificial intelligence. And so really excited for today's event. And we have a really good lineup today. And so we have experts, 4 different experts on artificial intelligence that will be with us today. And I'm not one of them, so 4. So at 10 a.m., we're going to have, in just in a little bit, or I guess it is 10 a.m., so just in a couple minutes, we'll have Revana Sharfuddin, who is Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's going to present on AI and the labor force, and that's also part of our Human Progress and Flourishing workshop series. After a short break, we'll have a break at 11, and then at 11:15, Will Rinehart, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, is going to present on AI regulation and policy. Then we have lunch, and then at 1:15, Dr. Jeremy Straub, who is a Senior Fellow at the Challey Institute, is going to moderate a panel that's going to include Revana Sharfuddin, Will Rinehart, and Taya Spelhaug, who is the Director of Microsoft's Fargo campus. So really excited about today's event, and thanks everybody for being here. This is a good crowd, and I'm excited about today. So without any further delay, I'm going to read Revana's bio. I'm excited that she made the trip here. She got here at midnight last night, and she was supposed to get here at about 4:45, I believe. And so kudos to Revana for showing up this morning after being up really late. You probably didn't sleep that well either. I don't know that, but thanks for being here. So Revana Sharfuddin is a research fellow at the Labor Policy Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research centers on labor economics, the evolving nature of work, and ways that labor markets can adapt to foster growth and mobility for workers with diverse backgrounds and needs. She also studies labor market dynamics across different institutional contexts, particularly in developing countries, with a focus on the role of women in the workforce and the interplay between work and family life. Her writing has been published in The Hill, the Dhaka Tribune, Reason, and other media outlets. She also writes for the Substack, Labor Market Matters. Before joining the Mercatus Center, Sharfuddin worked in various research support roles at institutions such as the Hoover Institution, IZA Institute for Labor Economics, the Cato Institute, and Sharfuddin holds a BA in economics from George Mason University, an MA in development economics from Friedrich Alexander Universität Aragon Nuremberg in Germany. So pardon the pronunciation. So Revana can correct my pronunciation. And so let's all give a warm welcome to Revana Sharfuddin.
Good morning, everyone. It's very good to be here today. And before I even start my presentation about AI and workforce, I think, how do we navigate this new world? How do we move forward with this new technology? Is something that's happening right here, right now, this morning, is that the wage premium or the advantage we're going to have as human workers are going to be being together in rooms, talking about ideas, building relationship, building trust, sharing ideas. So the fact that all of you are here today in this room, and we have had pandemic years, we have had classes being online for current education cohorts. So the fact that we are all here today is we're, I think, a bit already ahead of the game, thinking about this new world and how AI is going to change our work. So I'm going to try to see how the slide moves. Okay, this is the right way. So the fact that we are all here today is something that is going to be really important for moving forward, because some of the tasks that AI can automate really fast are the ones that we do remotely, such as writing, creating graphics design, or making some plans. But relationship building type jobs where it requires to have tacit skills, or we talk to colleagues, we talk to different members of the community, and those little cultural moments that is hard to kind of codify or reiterate or kind of bundle up as tasks and kind of automate are the type of jobs that I hope in future are going to have the type of wage premium we see when there is a new technology. So the rise of the social and tacit skills is something economists have been already seeing for a few years now. David Daming and co-authors had this paper in NBER that looked at data from 1980 to 2012, and they already saw that social skill intensive jobs grew 12 percentage point in that time period. And then math intensive jobs or computerization, coding intensive jobs, those jobs kind of shrank by 3.3 percentage point over the same period. So we see that the biggest wage gain in that period from 1980 to 2012 are in jobs where we had a combination of cognitive skills and social skills. So this is not something that is just happening at the advent of AI. That's been kind of brewing in the background for a while now. And this is exactly why we need to think about how we move forward in this economy and have this kind of awareness of shift in the labor market that's been already in place for a while. And then the way we look into the skill-based technology and then task-based technology is something to pay attention to. In previous periods of new technology shock that we saw in our economy, that has been computerization, that has been internet, or other types of shocks such as globalization or China shock, we have seen that the traditional view has been technology simply raised the demand for high-skill work, and then it raised the average wages. So what we have seen is, on average, in general equilibrium trade models, on average, we were all better off. And then there were some partial equilibrium effects, meaning if we looked at certain sectors, they were left behind. And there has been a tension in our society for perhaps not addressing those, because we wanted to be champions of technology, we wanted to be champions of innovation, we wanted to be champions of entrepreneurship. But because we didn't kind of address some of the industries that were left behind, there is some tension. But there is a new growing set of literature that is not looking at just one technology shock and how that increases productivity. It tries to look at task-based productivity gains, meaning you look at any job, you don't just say, oh, this job is getting better off versus worse off. You are kind of looking at this fine-grained version of a job. What is a job? A job is a bundle of tasks. So there are all these tasks you do morning throughout the afternoon, and we can pick an example of, maybe we are in an academic institute, how a researcher works for 8 hours a day. You have a bunch of planning you have to do, then you go into reading papers, then you go into writing papers, and then you have those literature reviews you combine, and then you publish, but maybe at the same time you want to do some, social media kind of promotion of your own job. So those are kind of the little tasks a researcher does. So now, a current strand of literature looks at how task-based jobs are moving. And at this task level, when you integrate AI in the workflow, how does that specific set of tasks move, and then how does it affect a job? Because looking at just one job and saying how this is changing due to AI is not adequate enough anymore. It's not explaining some of the effects that much anymore. So that's why we have kind of this new way of looking at a technology affecting occupations and industries, which is going through the fine-grained level of tasks. And there are two key channels that economists are trying to understand the productivity gain from this new technology. And these two channels are automation, meaning you have certain set of tasks completely automated, and in some cases, certain jobs completely automated by new technology. And the older view used to be, okay, this job is completely automated now, but we know about, classic Joseph Schumpeter example of creative destruction, that there are going to be new jobs available. So that was kind of a little bit of older set of literature, how it viewed it viewed technology in the process of economic growth. But the new strand of literature that is done by Nobel laureate Darren Acemoglu and his co-author David Otter is to look at how jobs are at task level augmenting people's productivity. Meaning, when you have a technology integrated at your workflow, your productivity is raising up. You are jumping into higher order tasks, and you are seeing that in labor demand, and you are seeing that in wages. So your wage should ideally be up in labor augmentation picture of it. So two ways of checking the mechanism: labor automation and labor augmentation. And the interesting question now is, what kind of AI is automating jobs? What kind of AI is augmenting job? And also, what kind of jobs are more prone to augmentation versus automation? So as society, as economy, we can have this awareness going forward to embrace the augmentation route more for ourselves individually, but also as businesses to have this proactive idea of how do we empower workforce, or also expand the gain for everyone rather than have a short-term understanding of how this technology is going to affect us and have just quickly automate certain tasks. So that would be kind of short-term understanding of it, and the gains are perhaps going to be limited. And we see in literature that these are the two ways the automation and augmentation are happening. And then we have just the task that is, instead of a worker potentially reducing the headcount of specific type of job, if you have automation, instead of having 100 employees in a plant, you will probably have fewer. And with augmentation, it might increase the types of jobs available, and you can see newer forms of jobs. So the economist David Otter and then Acemoglu talk about two types of automation. We have the so-so automation, meaning it possibly will wipe out a lot of the jobs. And then we have kind of the pro-worker AI, which is supposed to empower workers more. So let's look at some literature example. So one of the newest, I think this is published in 2025, actually, Harvard Business Study paper, and it looks at how displacement is happening in the labor market. Is it displacing jobs or being complementary to the already existing productivity? And they use this huge data set where we have all of the universe of job posting in the United States. These are called Lightcast data set, and where you can go in and check sectors and industries and see how the jobs are being posted, what kind of jobs are being posted, potential wages, potential industry, occupation, and things like that. And in that job posting data set via Lightcast, they see that after generative AI became a more mainstream thing, I think they used the ChatGPT launch, the first one we had in 2022, the OpenAI one. They check that timeline and see how productivity has changed and how job postings have changed. So they see that 17% decline in posting for occupation in top quartile for automation potential. So jobs that are going to potentially automate work, there's a decline in that already. So the market is preparing to already automate some job. But on the other side, there's 22% increase for top quartile augmentation occupations. So businesses are actually quite interested to have people be empowered with AI tools and do higher order tasks, do better types of job, be more productive, and bring more profit for the organization. And in turn, you can imagine if their productivity goes up, perhaps the wages also go up, and we see that in other studies. So this is a clean example of automation and augmentation playing out differently, even in the short run. There is a brilliant example that I see in this article called Toil and Technology by James Besson. He uses the example, augmentation example for ATM booths. So when the ATM started to become a mainstream thing in the 1988 and afterwards, we have seen so many ATM booths open up with banks around us. But at the same time, we could imagine that bank tellers would lose their jobs. So potentially we would see that the bank tellers are not seeing the same amount of employment. They're not seeing the same amount of wages and so on. But what we ended up seeing is that because we had more ATMs, the bank's business business just blew up. There were so many banks around, and I was actually talking to a podcast and a radio. Those were Fargo-based before this event, and I brought up this study, and one of the hosts told me that I don't need to look at data for me to tell you that ATMs blew up. I just drive around Bismarck and I can see it. So yes, there is the anecdotal evidence. There is something we already see, and this is something we can really study through financial data and bank data. So ATM is a very clean, neat example of how certain types of occupation got completely automated, meaning we're not relying on a human individual to hand us our cash. We just go to a machine, but then we go to different types of bankers, which is actually kind of relationship banking type of jobs, where we go to the bank and we talk to the banker about the mortgage, about student loan, how to plan our entire finance. So this is exactly what I was talking about in the beginning, is that when this kind of automation happens, first of all, we get elevated to higher order tasks. We know that as humans, we don't enjoy doing those rote methods at our work that are codified, that are iterative, and you do it over and over again. And that's something you see in Karl Marx literature, is that how capitalism creates this rote task and your status goes away, or your the happiness you get from job goes away. And we see through the evolution of capitalism and evolution of growth and evolution of technology, is that market forces have the power to almost fight that also, just through market mechanisms, which is when you have technology, when you have innovation, people are finding ways to automate things. They don't want to do this road task. I don't think you would need central planning for that to happen. We see that through technology, through computerization, that all of this iterative, boring, mundane task that doesn't speak to our soul. We're a worker, we're also people, our identity, how we contribute to society. Those are the jobs that are coming to us with technology. We're getting towards higher order tasks, and the ATM is the really perfect, neat example for it, because just to get the cash, you go to the machine, but when you need some human support, some advice, some guidance, you go to your relationship banker, and those jobs have boomed over the years. So moving on to kind of understanding how we can measure how AI is going around in our economy, which is slightly difficult because we don't have the data to go into the firms and ask them, how are you really using AI at your workplace? Why would they give us that data? Those are very private and oftentimes cost a ton of money. It would be really hard to aggregate. Now, microeconomists, labor economists are making an effort to work with government agencies who do large-scale surveys, such as BLS, BEA, to include more modules for asking survey questions. And then even then, it's not the perfect data, right? Because you're asking people and they say certain things, they behave certain ways. We know about these biases we see in surveys. So we are still trying to find neat ways to really cut through the noise and get clean data of how people are using artificial intelligence. One way that is becoming really prominent tool for labor economists and people in this space doing the research is looking into the Anthropic Economic Index. So Anthropic is the producer that make Claude, that one of the I think it's the top three. It's in the top three most used AI technology. I think the first one is obviously OpenAI, and then we have Gemini, and then we have Claude. And they have this economic index starting from spring this year. They have kind of being an early mover in this space. They wanted to make sure that people really understand this new technology. So what they ended up doing is that they have this tool called Clio. It's a very neat tool where they programmed that they will take all of the chats being used in non-enterprise version of Claude. The enterprise versions are where you have specific contract with businesses and organization that your data is not going to be used for trading, but the non-enterprise version of it, and you anonymize the chats because they are quite concerned about privacy and security. So they anonymize the chat and they codify it to see how people are using this data. And the best part about it, they make it publicly available, which is really, really neat for researchers, social science researchers, economists. So you can go on their website, pull this data and do your analysis. And some of the things that they do there is that they use the ONET data set that's by our government agencies, where you have occupations and task levels neatly neatly categorized. So they take the on-net data, they take their anonymized chats, and they match it. They match it to see how people are using AI. So there are questions like which industries are what kind of questions people are asking in the chat. Are they industry-based question? Do these questions signal which occupation, which field you're in? And then they try to see how are people using the tool. Are they using the tool to teach themselves certain things? Are they using the tool to completely automate some tasks? So, or are they using the tool to kind of elevate their own productivity level? So it's not perfect, obviously, but they take up some proxies from some of the tag they see in their questionnaire. So this anthropic economic index is becoming a really prominent tool in labor economics field for people who are trying to study this. So we see that in anthropic economic index that there is more augmentation than full automation. Full automation is very, very small. It's in single digit. And we see what kind of places AI is being used. Another interesting question I received in the radio show I was in, actually the podcast I was in, they were talking about, in Fargo, folks are really worried about the manufacturing jobs. They're worried about the farming jobs, how AI is coming for those jobs and replacing. And I mean, right now at this stage, we can safely say we don't have to worry about those fields yet, because AI is the majority of AI tools are affecting the knowledge economy. So if the conversation needs to happen, if there is worries around it, that's where the conversation needs to happen. And I think with a manual job that are very much high skill still, agriculture type or manufacturing type, there are potentials for AI to be integrated, and people are using that. But we don't have to be similarly worried just because how people are using AI. And some of the more augmentation processes happening which was fascinating for me. People were using it to teach themselves things. They were using it to teach themselves coding. They were using to teach themselves how to do some math problems. And obviously, we're here talking about global innovation and development economics and growth, both in the US context and globally. And we can already imagine the vast impact AI could have for education purposes if used correctly. So this is a little bit of a problem. Even though this is one of the very neat, nice tool we have, there is a big problem because, in the United States, colloquially, when we talk about household cleaning products, for example, we don't say the name of like tissue or something, we say Kleenex. And the household name for AI tools are becoming actually ChatGPT and not Anthropic. Whenever somebody is saying, I'm going to go use AI for this today, we don't even say we're going to use AI. A lot of people say, I'm going to go ChatGPT this thing. So this is the household name for our AI usage, and Anthropic is not that much widely used. So even if we have data from them, this is not a good representation of what is happening in the economy here or even globally. So we have to be very aware of it when we use it. And this is particularly interesting because folks, workers who are using AI for using multiple AI, they have 2, 3, they're specialized user. They know how to prompt very well. They really invest a lot of time. And what do they try to achieve when they have multiple access to multiple AI tools? What they try to do is that how much of my task can I give away as much as I can, and so I can explore other things. And I mean, I use multiple AI also for my research job, and I also try to see, okay, how can I expand my thinking time, and I give away some of the coding, some of the planning part of the work. So what I'm trying to tell you guys here is that Anthropic is actually concentrated by kind of very different types of user, kind of advanced user. So the engineers who are using Anthropic, they're using it to make sure they can automate as much as they can. So if we even see that a lot of automation is happening through Anthropic data, my understanding is that more automation is happening in Anthropic than maybe ChatGPT, because the users are going to be very different. So that there is going to be selection bias. There is going to be, we have to make sure that when we're interpreting the results, we have to interpret it with appropriate use cases. So these are some of the caveats of this data. Then there are also more literature coming out of how people are adopting generative AI. So obviously, one neat way is to look into the data from the AI companies, look at OpenAI, look at Anthropic, look at Gemini. And another way is our old methodology is go and do survey with people. And the first generative AI survey was done by David Deming and co-authors from Harvard, and they did it. They released the first one in August 2024, and they find that 39 to 40% US adults age 18 to 64 had used generative AI. We have to be very cautious about this because there are other surveys, similar surveys done later, but we can say, oh, 40% of the adults use ChatGPT. But you go through the survey questions, and the questions are, have you used ChatGPT at least once last week? So this is very different than people regularly using ChatGPT. So we have to be very cautious about how we interpret these results. And as you can see, 24% of workers used it in previous week, which is, we cautious interpretation of these results. And for work purposes, people used it 28%. And I think this is the most important part and most useful part for our purposes is that 1 to 8% of all work hours were assisted by generative AI. So that's where we can see very high usage. So that's the research done by David Deming and co-authors. And we can see also from their research exactly where people are using ChatGPT and similar types of generative AI. And afterwards, there were co-authors from U Chicago and Hoover Institute, John Hartley, Vitor Mello, also Mercatus affiliate. They did another survey to look into all of the workers in the United States, and they also see similar results of about 40% of usage at least once a week in the past week, usage of generative AI. And they also look at productivity data. They see that 1 to 2% productivity bump. So how do they check the productivity data? They take the survey data and they match it with the already existing data we have through BLS. And BLS has data on productivity. BLS has data on wages. How do BLS have these data? So generally, all of the private businesses in the United States, they have to send in payroll information to government agencies for understanding for unemployment insurance purposes if they're paying for the unemployment insurance taxes. But then economists can utilize the data because that's the best available resource we have to understand the US economy. So you take those data and you match it with the survey data and you try to see where in places where you have kind of generative AI exposure, are their productivity going up? Are they working more hours? Which is fascinating to me because you would think people are automating a lot of the tasks. They probably will have to work less, but they're actually working more. And I guess some of the people are tapping into their entrepreneurial energy and checking other avenues of career and research. So recently, I have seen some articles of people popularizing this term of polywork, which is something economists have known for a long time. That means multiple job holding, but we have a fancy, fun term for it now, polywork. And there are all these media pieces going around that people are doing a lot of polywork. It must be terrible for our economy that people cannot meet their expenses, so they have to take a lot of jobs. But another version of it, looking at it, is that there are so many jobs to go around that people can take many jobs. And we see from macro evidence that when in recession, people are actually not doing polywork because you don't have that many jobs there. But kind of bringing this example here to make this point that people are now using AI to explore their passion projects, to take a bet on things that they're passionate about, their hobby project. Can I really make my hobby a full-time job, or do I have to stick to this 9 to 5 that provides for me? So people are really using AI a lot for entrepreneurial activities, and even though people are finishing more tasks faster, they're working more, which is a fascinating scene in the labor market. We have more information from Hartley and Mello survey for who's using generative AI, and we definitely see that younger and more educated workers are using it. Higher income individuals are using it more. For certain generative AI, you have to make a paid subscription. So that makes a lot of sense. And then eventually we also need to think about how generative AI is going around in the world. And if paid services somehow you get access, then kind of the bigger gains we can achieve from generative AI from in implementing it all over the world would be to go into developing countries, rural areas, and people can access education. But if most services or higher quality services are paid, we're not going to be able to see those gains. And it's interesting to kind of see the development of this area and kind of keep an eye on it and see how it progresses. And people are doing a lot of research to kind of study these things. So similarly, from this research, we see that people self-report that they're taking up more complex tasks. They're gaining more efficiency and speed when they're doing their job, and of course, some evidence of job reshaping. We're seeing different types of titles emerge. We are seeing different types of, and these are the research we see through LinkedIn, and LinkedIn has their data, and they do an annual report of newer types of jobs posted. Obviously, there are lots of worried that certain knowledge jobs are going to be seriously affected. For example, consultancy types jobs are the kind of entry-level consulting types jobs or something that are going to be affected. But through LinkedIn data and so on, we see that in those type of fields, there are lots of new types of job, but we're not able to study those through our BLS data because we didn't add those titles and occupations in our government surveys yet. But from private surveys or web-based data where you can scrape some of the websites, you can see that there are new titles emerging. So this kind of goes back to social skill and wage premium of this new technology and where the world is moving forward. So cognitive skills with low social tasks, those are the one where you might see a lower level of employment, lowering wages, but a lot of jobs where you need coordination, persuasion, care, soft skills, understanding of different culture, talking across different culture. Those are the things that where you might see a flourishing of new jobs and wage premium. So this is a topic that might be hard for a lot of students right now, and I thought it would be interesting to address it and also talk through it together. We would have opportunity to talk after, have Q&A, so I would be really interested to hear everybody's perspective on this. But there are lots of media pieces going around that entry-level jobs, recent graduate jobs are really getting negatively affected. Lots of people are struggling to find jobs. Now we cutting through the noise and figuring out what actually is happening to kind of go through this new world and navigate this new macro environment. So obviously entry-level job is very, very important for social mobility, for human capital development, but also it's the first step in the ladder to move up in career progress. So if we are seeing a serious break in entry-level jobs, that will be quite bad. But it's important to realize if that's really happening first. And the second thing, if that's happening, is that AI doing that? And we don't have a lot of evidence coming out on this topic. What we have is a lot of media coverage. One example is that I think I saw recently, and please correct me later if I'm saying this wrong, I think about 30,000 jobs, 30,000 workers were laid off in Amazon. I think that's the number that I saw on media, which seems very scary. But then you look at all of the jobs that opens new jobs that are added in the United States every year. They're close to 1 million. So 30,000 job is kind of a drop in the bucket. So we have to think about the aggregate economy and how that's changing and not get super anxious with some of these headline figures. What we need to check then is carefully done studies that are national level, and also consider the macro conditions we're in outside of AI. We are in a situation that we have a lot of tariffs uncertainty, we have immigration supply related issues. So when your outside external conditions are this way and you're a business owner, what are you going to do? Possibly pause hiring and see how things go. So that can be one explanation. And the second explanation is a lot of people talk about post-COVID hiring spree. Lots of hiring happened at the time, so you cool down your hiring after. So that's definitely another explanation. So some of the other things are also happening in the economy that we need to keep an eye on, but also maybe AI is playing some role, but how attributing and saying AI is causing all of this job loss is not a very helpful narrative without having proper causal empirical evidence to back this up. So that's where to go next step is that to look at what's the best quality evidence we have on this topic. So we have this new paper coming out called "The Canaries in the Coal Mine," and this is done by top economists from Stanford, Digital Economy Lab, and Eric Brynolfsson and co-author. And they look at ADP data, that's the private payroll data, and they focus on workers who are aged 22 to 25 in occupations that are very with varying AI exposure. This is important to keep in mind at this stage, is that they use Anthropic to kind of bring in which tasks and which occupations are being affected by AI. So again, this is not a very good proxy because Anthropic is not a good representation of the entire economy, but that's the best we got. And they see that there is this is a massive data set. They are able to slice through different age group, and they can see actual, as best as we can, actual employment effect and not just some sort of theoretical exposure. So in that study, they see that 13% of youth employment decline, and then that happens more in AI-exposed occupation defined by the Anthropic Economic Index. For older workers and in the same occupation, they see stable and sometimes even rising employment, and declines concentrated in occupation where AI is more likely to automate than augment. Wages are largely flat. Adjustment shows up in headcounts, not pay. So in their study, pay is unaffected, but you are seeing a lower employment level for entry-level worker in fields where you have high AI exposure, but you don't see it in fields where you have AI augmented possibilities for that field. And they present a set of stylized facts that I kind of summarized. But we have to be very, very careful in this study. So we have to understand that this is not a causal study, meaning this is an observational study. We don't have a natural experiment, a situation that we see in many economics literature. So we have to interpret the result with caution. I would really like to bring attention to this chart because it went all over the place. It became very popular, and you can see the line that is going through. I think it's 2022. I'm having a little bit hard time seeing it from here. And you can see the blue line that's going down. That's the early career, early graduate employment for software development. And this is the data to show that this is the segment of the economy that is getting really badly affected. But if you really closely see the blue line, you see the trend of the jobs, the employment going down already starts a bit early, actually, a bit before the line that's going through OpenAI. So my understanding is that maybe there is some effect of AI, but something else was already going on in the field of software development and young early career workers, because we see a little bit pre-trend. So for economists to say AI is causing young grad unemployment rate, what needs to happen is that all of the lines need to be parallel, and right before the break, you can't see a pre-trend, which you see here. So obviously, this is a sign that something is happening there, and possibly AI is playing a role, but you cannot say that AI is causally affecting this job displacement. I just wanted to bring this chart up because it's really going around everywhere and becoming really popular to talk about a very scary situation for young grads that I don't think we should so confidently attribute to AI. And so there are other literature going on to understand what is going on in entry-level jobs, what is going on in young grad unemployment rate. And a prominent journalist who was also a data scientist, John Barn Murdoch at Financial Times, he did a very nice piece there where he looked through data of men and women and different sector for this particular age group. What he ended up seeing, if you pull out men and women, the new grad unemployment rate looks very different. Actually, women are doing really well right after graduation, and young men are unfortunately struggling. And he explains this phenomena through a story of sectoral shift. Our tech sector seems to be not doing very well right now, and the healthcare sector is just booming. It's just growing very much, and the wages are going up, and lots of new hire. And we know that men and women self-select into occupations differently, and women tend to go into care-based occupation more. So a lot of women self-select into healthcare profession, and they're doing quite well. So another line of argument would be the new grad unemployment rate is not something to do with AI. Perhaps there is a huge sectoral shift happening in the economy, and AI is kind of multiplying the effect. So that's another story. And I think the radiologist story is kind of goes to demonstrate how just because an occupation has very high AI exposure, that doesn't automatically mean they're going to be very negatively affected. And also another very successful example of healthcare industry using a lot of AI and really booming and becoming bigger field and becoming a really robust field. Radiology field had the most use cases of AI in the last decade or so. I think about 70% of the new AI tools were added to the radiology field. And even then, people are seeing lots of new jobs. And I think on average, radiologists in the United States make $500,000 per year. So this is a good example of how AI exposure didn't actually change anything. So it also goes to telling that if we take those anthropic data and say, these jobs were exposed to AI, match it with wage data, and there are lots of other things going around there, and it's not telling us the full story. But what would need to happen is for us to work with different farms closely or do more research in experimental setting to really pull apart each occupation at task level, have a more apples to apples comparison in the best way we can, given this is a social science, and match similar types of work or give them AI tool, or vary them by experience level, vary them by other different attributes, and see how AI affects their job. So if we look at, this goes back to the point I earlier made, exposure scores can mislead policymakers. So what can we do in case there is a big AI displacement at the early career level? One big opportunity that a lot of us seem to miss is that business opportunities, because business entrepreneurship, these are the jobs where we need those tacit skill, where we need those relationship building, where we need to bring people together in the same room, and entrepreneurship would be hard to automate. On the other hand, for small businesses, having AI is a great way to start a business, to make your business plan, to do a lot of, for example, media, graphic designing work, automate those tasks. So there are lots of baby boomer businesses that are ready to exit. And we see from data, we see from surveys that they don't quite have the exit plan because they don't have the next generation in their family that are ready to take up this businesses. So thinking for newer generation, for instead of going into knowledge economy or white collar jobs, to go back to kind of the spirit of America, to go back to entrepreneurial energy and tap into these new businesses, and think about taking a bet on yourself in that way, because we already as students take lots of student loan, and that's something already taking a bet on yourself. So maybe transferring those into some sort of business energy for next generation would be a path forward to navigate some of, in case there is a big break in entry-level job, which we don't see yet. And there are this is a more private sector opportunity to consider, but there are certain things we can also do in policy. So I already discussed this part with how AI can lower the cost of starting and scaling farms. So I move along here. So real world example of AI farms training workers with AI. So if we're worried about a serious new graduate unemployment rate, we need to think about, okay, are there right incentives for businesses to train a new worker to kind of shift them up to next level in their occupation. Why is this important? Because the entry level, there might be a skill gap, serious skill gap, right? Students are going through college and they're used to certain types of occupation, and the academic system and the curriculum are used to certain types of occupation, and they're preparing this graduate students for that, the undergrad students for that, and you exit the market and the new jobs are looking kind of different. So there can be a skill mismatch. So what needs to happen is that for that entry level, if the businesses are incentivized, are also able to train entry level worker, that would potentially help navigate that problem. Why? Because at the entry level, you're hiring a new person. For you to invest in this person, spend more money in this person that you don't know quite well, that's a big risk for businesses. So what we see for consultancy firms, they are hiring much fewer entry-level workers. What they're doing is they're training a lot their older age cohorts, and then people who have stayed in the company longer. And this goes to showing that companies have the interest to train their workers for these new types of jobs. Deloitte partnered with Anthropic, and I think they trained 1,500 of their workers, but none of them are entry level. They are already existing, and it's easier for you to make this decision, this cost decision of investing in workers who are already here. You know them, you have trust, versus you're hiring somebody new and you don't want to spend on them already. But are there solutions to navigate that? So I recently wrote a policy brief to think about how do we make it easier for businesses to invest in their worker. Currently in our tax code, we have a serious disincentive for human capital investment. We have, through one big beautiful bill this year, also previously, we had this tax provision where businesses are allowed to expense their costs for investing in new technology, new tools, new equipment, before it was set in a bonus depreciation schedule, which is a policy tool that you can expense the cost of your business, investing in your business over a certain period of time and certain percentage of the cost. That was the bonus depreciation. But this year, through one big beautiful bill, there is a provision now you can immediately expense 100% of the cost of investing in equipments, investing in AI tools, investing in R&D, which is very pro-growth. That's we see lots of very positive GDP results for this kind of policies. What is missing is that translation of that same policy for human capital investment. So when now businesses are training their employees, they're investing in their employees, they cannot expense those costs. And on paper they can, but there are 6 barriers for them to do those. And one big one is that if the training you're providing your worker qualifies as minimum education requirement, you are not able to expense those costs, meaning you have a serious disincentive to train your new worker and train new entrants. But the new entrant jobs are fundamentally changing. So there is a serious problem that we can solve through reflecting the capital tax expensing provision into human capital tax expensing provision. I outline in my policy brief 6 bottlenecks that exist in our tax codes. One of them is obviously minimum education requirement, but some of the ones are just seriously damaging. There is one that says if you're training your worker for not a current role but future role, you are not able to expense that cost, which is really wild for me, because all of the jobs are changing. You will have to train your workers for a future role. So I'm not quite sure where some of these policies came from in our IRS code. My hunch is probably these were ad hocs based on some abuse cases. So getting rid of them would be a very pro-growth and tax-neutral way of moving forward. It's not a tax credit. It's not government picking winners or losers. We're empowering local businesses, and they're able to respond to local business conditions. And I'm happy to chat more about this policy brief. I'm happy to also share this later. Anybody interested to read more? And this is how we can align the incentives to protect this entry-level job worries and empower businesses and incentivize businesses to train young workers, but also any workers they seem are going to be valuable for their farm. So this is to make a point that it doesn't have to be this scary situation where we don't know where things are going. It can be, we can be more mindful and aware of this new situation. Some of that has to do with the economy, but the rest is has to do with actually society, of how to move forward as a society in this new technology. A lot of us, our social life have severely, lives have severely affected by COVID, and we did a lot of things remotely. We weren't together with other people, our peers, our professors, our other people who are ahead in our careers, our mentors. We were just disconnected from them. And then comes AI, who's ready to take up all of the jobs we were able to do remotely. So some of the things have to be societies coming together, being together in presence, gathering the courage to talk to each other, which can be a very scary for newer age cohorts, which were not used to a lot of in-person interactions. And also thinking, how can I use AI to elevate my skills? Because a lot of the positive things about AI is that how much you can teach yourself, but at the same time, thinking about entrepreneurial ideas and thinking about maybe knowledge economy is not the next step for me. Maybe there are lots of business ideas around, looking around the local economic conditions and thinking about those things. And also from business point of views, how can we make it easier for us, ourselves to train our workers, and how can we engage with policymakers, engage with public to spread this research, because there are lots of noise around this topic. This is new, and a lot of us, even economists, are struggling to even figure out how to conduct this research, because we have to think about all new empirical methods. So coming together as society and thinking about, we need to have this awareness to move forward. And I think that's how we have more control over not only just economy, our community and our society. Thank you.
Please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I wanted to find out from you if there's any research concerning how AI can exacerbate mental health issues in the United States.
I actually don't have research on that. I could look into it for you and send you some materials, but I think field of psychology would be the place to look for this. My research mostly focuses on workforce and business and so on.
Deloitte is using Anthropic data to advance some of its training.
They're partnering up with Anthropic to do some training for their consultants, yes.
You mentioned that they're focused more on folks that have had some longevity with the organization.
Yes, they're mid-career to senior levels, yes.
So what are your thoughts on having AI training to enhance that personal relationship, which really raises the value of those longevity employees?
Sorry, can you repeat that question one more time? Yes.
What are your thoughts on using AI to advance the interpersonal skills of those employees that are long-term employees with Deloitte? How can AI help them with their interpersonal skills and that wage premium?
I think it's actually doing the opposite. I think it's automating as much as the consultancy task it can, because a lot of people were assuming consultancy jobs will just go away, because so much of the tasks consultants do are making slide decks, making Excel sheets, making PowerPoints, and those you can very easily do with AI. So the AI training is done to automate those, and the relationship building part of the consultancy job is where the premium is. And that's where the senior and mid-career people are intact, because they have built those relationships in their ecosystem. And there are literature around why do we even have consultants. There are economic theories around it. And a big part of it is sometimes maybe in your own organization, you know how to change some of the dynamics, firm structure, but it's hard for you to fire a bunch of people and make this tough decision and then validate your decision in the long term. What consultants do from economic theory, we learn they validate these tough choices externally with a big institutional badge. So that's kind of the human tacit part of it. So that part you cannot automate, right? That's why consultants, in my opinion, will exist forever. But even though the slide decks can be made in a click with AI, and that's why they're training their mid-career workers that automate as much as you can, and then we kind of keep those relationship building part of the tasks.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to ask about education industry. How do you think, or do you have evidences that education K-12 and university professorship, will it change with respect to, teaching and instructing, because of AI just concentrating more on personalized education?
That is a very good question. I think education experts would be more equipped to answer it. But in general, I think there is going to be certain educational model change. The way I think about it is how the advent of Khan Academy changed some of the understanding of how we learn. And I personally have experience with those. I am born and raised in Bangladesh. I moved to the US as international student. I see many international students in front of me, so it's it's a great pleasure. But when Khan Academy started, I was back in Bangladesh and I was learning a lot of these calculus classes through his videos, but that never replaced the need for academia, the need for college. That was just a complement and not a substitute, because some of the mentorship, some of the career guidance, there is something about being in a class in front of a professor and learning that has, I think about Oxford, that university is standing for 1,000 years. It has seen all. So some of the education model, I believe, is here to stay. But I also understand my expertise is limited to make a comment here.
Thank you. So I'm curious, with a lot of companies adapting AI for their workforce development, for augmenting a lot of tasks, are you seeing workers having to take on more responsibility or more job tasks because some of their time is being saved due to AI?
I would say the things we see in data is possibly not taking more tasks, but tasks being shifted up. So you're giving away some of those email writing, marketing campaigns, and so on, and you are finding out different types of tasks. One good example is actually my own life. I used to spend more time doing some of the more coding-related work, and now I come here and give speeches. And so my task kind of shifted off human engagement and meeting with people, meeting policymakers, and maybe a bit less coding or learning some of the coding. So just thinking about my experience and thinking how the economy is reshuffling, I would say that the tasks are shifting rather than expanding altogether.
Other questions? Oh.
Thanks. I would suggest that, like previous technologies, AI is being dramatically poorly used right now, because while people are looking about employees, I would say that the interaction with personnel is being ignored. Look at customer service positions being replaced by AI. It's extremely difficult to do. I recently just tried to set an appointment to have a computer work looked at. AI kept saying, "I don't hear you. I don't understand you." You know, you just shook your head like this, like, "Oh, it's frustrating." Yes. And yet that is what's not being addressed. They're replacing positions, but they're not training people to be able to interact. And that's where the interpersonal relationships come into play. Anybody who's never tried to sell something has never understood the fear and the concern that a buyer has on any purchase. I would suggest that, as an example, you made the comment about 30,000 people lost their jobs. Probably made 1 million jobs over here.
Exactly.
But you're not one of those 30,000 people that lost their jobs.
Yeah.
Nobody takes that into account. It's that, how do we address this?
Yeah.
Instead, there are a lot of high-level executives who are making a lot of money by replacing people with AI, but later on, when AI has caused many of their customers to leave, well, that's somebody else's problem. I really think that economics is looking at this from a, as you've often said, a theoretical standpoint, but not from an applied standpoint. I think much more work needs to be done in that level. I'm not asking a question, I'm making a comment.
I'm so glad you made this point, because as soon as I said 30,000 job loss and I looked at you and you were like, no. So I really wanted to hear your point, what pushback you might have. And you were very correct about the full potential of AI possibly is not being extracted because we're not taking it. Businesses are not, for short-term reasons, and we have other intertemporal incentive realignment problems. They're not thinking about augmentation as much as they should. And Eric Brynolfsson, whose study I mentioned multiple times, he wrote a piece where he did like a very simple graphic of, if we only automate how the economy, the gains are going to look probably this much in a, if I have like a Venn diagram. And if we augment, it's going to expand so much more. And the thing is, I think businesses are not realizing it because they're just like, oh, let's just get rid of some people and make a lot of money in those headline numbers, not at least not in the aggregate economy, but at least for those headline numbers. But they're gonna come to a point of self-correction, because a lot of you and I are being frustrated when we're calling customer service, and they're gonna understand this customer response in a few months, and they're gonna try to correct that. Tyler Cowen, who is a prominent figure in Mercatus Center, also a public intellectual, he recently wrote a piece of how businesses need to restructure thinking about AI, and they're not doing that enough. So I think you're very accurate on your assessment of the situation. Also, economics as a field, as I mentioned multiple times, the empirical models we have, the data we have, they're not there yet. We are working on it. This is a new field for everyone and economists.
We have time for one more question.
As per your presentation, you have mentioned that there is a strong shift towards the healthcare for AI usage. And how do you see this AI shifting, especially in the healthcare domain, from reactive treatment to the preventive side?
That is something I would ask a healthcare expert. This is not, I don't have information on that, I apologize.
Okay. And in case of like economic wise, when you are redesigning the policies with respect to AI, like the next question we learned about, like how do you enforce through your policies on AI human collaboration? Like a recent last week, we had a Cloudflare downtime. That is because of the most of the workers have been reduced, and it impacted a lot of like the world economy also. So in that situations, how these economy policy makers are going to address on like, yes, of course, AI is helping, but how do we add that human collaboration?
I think the way I try to address it in my policy work is to think about how to incentivize worker trainings for businesses. How do we make it easy? How do we make it less expensive on them? But also some of the things you mentioned, I think they relate a bit more to the governance side of AI. How do we govern this technology? And that would be the perfect person would be our next speaker to address some of these governance issues. And I hope you guys also have a vibrant discussion on that.
Good morning again, everybody. This is our next session. Really, we've already had a great conversation so far. I'm excited about the next presentation as well. We have Will Rinehart from the American Enterprise Institute that is presenting now. Will is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on political economy of technology and innovation. His research covers policy areas such as diagnostic testing regulation, federal agency regulatory guidance, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the regulation of artificial intelligence. He also serves as an expert at the Federalist Society's Emerging Technology Working Group, which is part of the Regulatory Transparency Project. Before joining AEI, Mr. Rinehart was a senior fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. He was also the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, a research fellow at Tech Freedom, and the Director of Operations at the International Center for Law and Economics. Additionally, Mr. Rinehart worked for the Progress and Freedom Foundation, focusing on advertising policy and internet governance, the Illinois Policy Institute, where he studied state-level budget, energy, and tax issues, and the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement at the University of Illinois, Chicago as a research assistant in technology and civic engagement. Mr. Rinehart was a fellow at the Internet Law and Policy Foundry and Frederick Bastiat Fellow at the Mercatus Center. Additionally, he served on the Federal Communications Commission's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee and Consumer Advocacy Committee. Mr. Rinehart's work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Wired, Morning Consult, The Hill, Forbes, Reason, Marginal Revolution, and Overlawyered, and on BBC Radio and NPR, in addition to other broadcast media. He speaks regularly on topics related to tech policy, has been cited in regulatory orders from the Federal Communications Commission, and has been featured in the Supreme Court petitions. Mr. Rinehart has a MS in Applied Economics from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in Political Science from the University of Illinois. So as you can tell by his extensive resume, he's very qualified to talk about AI regulation. I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. Let's all welcome Mr. Will Rinehart.
Is it on? Yeah, there we go. Look at that. Hello, everyone. Don't think ill of me because I'm from Illinois. That's how I want to start off this conversation. But actually, I want to start off with something that I think kind of struck me. Right. So imagine, for example, you got up in the morning and you're going to work. You start, working on a project, and you end up, opening up your Excel spreadsheet, and you're like, I really want to change this number because clearly, we got an update recently, and you realize, actually, I can't do that. I have to go ask every single person in my data spreadsheet if I can update this. This seems like kind of like a weird thing to suggest and even imagine, but this is actually what a state AI bill from California suggested. It was what's called AB 1018. And the State Water Board specifically said that they were worried if this bill in particular were to be passed, that they, wouldn't be able to use Excel spreadsheets. When they went to update them, that they would require a whole bunch of approvals from every single person in order to actually do this. And the reason I'm suggesting this, right, and this is the bill, AB 1018. This is something I was following very closely. The reason I'm suggesting this is because fundamentally, this is really the kind of the bulk of my talk today, which is a lot about this relationship between these regulatory structures, between a lot of these new bills. Thankfully, this bill was not passed, but there's a lot of bills that are being suggested in the state level. There's a lot that's going on the federal level. And what I'm really seeing is a lot of conflicts. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time today. I also speak kind of quickly, and I originally prepped about 45 minutes with like 15 minutes of talk. So if I go quickly through some of this stuff, we're going to need some more questions and answer session. But don't worry, I used to teach, and I can start picking on people and ask for very specific questions. But I think this will, I think this will get the blood moving here a bit. This is something that I think is very interesting. I think kind of exemplifies the actual tension we're seeing here, right? This is Scott Wiener. He is currently going for the state Senate seat, and we'll see. So I'm sorry, not state Senate, but federal Senate. He's currently a state senator. He has been one of the people, and we'll talk about him here shortly, this bill that he's passed. But basically, I think this is very indicative of what's actually going on, broadly speaking, within the state level policy, right? That we have an opportunity to apply the hard lessons we've learned over the last decade as we've seen the consequences of allowing unchecked growth of new technology without evaluating, understanding, or mitigating the risks. He's clearly talking about social media, right? Like he's talking about social media and the problems that we've had with social media. And what I think is very interesting is that effectively, this, I think, is kind of the mentality of a lot of legislators now, right? That we didn't really do enough with social media, and we really have to get ahead of these things, or we have to get ahead of this thing, right? But I would make a comparison here between this mentality and something that was generally considered bipartisan back in 1997, right? Admittedly, that was 1997, almost 30 years ago. But Clinton had this, what was called the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce. And he said, where government involved is needed, the aim should be to support and enforce predictable, minimalist, consistent, and simple legal environment for commerce. This, I think, is really where the reason I'm bringing this up and the reason why I'm trying to compare these two is because we really have seen a shift. I've seen a shift specifically in the last really 3-4 years on how people are understanding AI laws and really the drive to do something on AI, right? It feels like people, think that we kind of messed up with social media, which I don't really think is the case. But there's a lot of drive to do things today in a way that I just have never seen this before. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is generally my talk a bit, right? So 3 things I'm going to hit on. The bulk of it's going to be on the second section, which is state laws and federal laws, and kind of going through the various state and federal level fights, and there have been a lot. But I'm going to start with this idea of 3 frameworks, 3 ways to think about these problems, 3 general ways to think about problems. And I'm going to end with some of the projects that I've been working on, something I'm really excited about right now, which is using LLMs for cost compliance estimates. I think that there's a lot of benefits, and especially if you're, a researcher, you're in political science, you're in economics, I think there's a lot of things that we can be doing with these tools, and I kind of want to, suggest it and try to get those ideas also going. So the reason I'm starting with frameworks is actually because of something I read a couple years ago. Well, not a couple years ago, decade ago, 2 decades ago, from one of the people who's going to be talking early next year, Deirdre McCluskey. She's actually one of my professors at University of Illinois, Chicago. And when I read this original piece, it kind of floored me. It was 20 years ago that I read this, now I'm thinking about it. But she said, I think very artfully that, the market for apartments in New York, says The Economist, is just like a curve. And I think that's actually what we want to think about when we're thinking about frameworks, right? That these metaphors or models or frameworks, they really help us to try to understand things that are going on in the world. And, the way that you can try to understand the world is to try to create a lattice work of these different things. So I want to give you at least 3 different ways of thinking about understanding AI currently. Now, admittedly, these are flexible, and but I think that this can help try to understand this problem more writ large. So the first thing I would suggest is what I'm calling the AI regulatory stack. There's this conception out there that, Congress is doing nothing. The government's doing nothing on AI. Well, I don't really think that's correct, right? And I put together what is called the AI regulatory stack. I mean, there could be a better term for this, right? But effectively, when you look at our regulatory system that exists currently, we have so many different ways of actually going at these problems, right? We have financial regulation, we've got insurance and accident compensation regulation, we've got product recall law, we've got data privacy laws, we have consumer protection laws. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can get at this problem. And when people really talk about AI bills and AI laws, I think that's the first thing you should be suggesting, or at least thinking about, right? What is it that we already have that we can extend? Because oftentimes when people talk about new laws, there's a lot less discussion of perhaps doing more enforcement, right? That currently what we could do, instead of, say, pressing, and there's been a whole bunch of these cases, right? There's been literally hundreds of actions of the federal government, from the Food and Drug Administration, from the FTC, from NIST, from the Department of Education, right? There's been a whole bunch of these things. I've literally been collecting them, and I have a website that'll be going live early next year. There are literally hundreds of these actions, right? Through the FTC, through the FDA, through a whole bunch of our current regulatory structure, we're doing a lot. And I think that that's not well appreciated, which I hope would be understood. But fundamentally, government may be slow, and I think people kind of think that Congress is not doing anything, but really Congress is, maybe Congress can help here, but a lot of the mechanisms are already in place. And, a big one, which I'm not going to talk about today, are all of these copyright laws that are currently going through the courts. I think there's about 52 of them, right? They're all over the United States. There's a whole bunch of these that could fundamentally change how each one of these companies works, right? Anthropic, right? You'll notice some of the big players here: Anthropic, NVIDIA, ChatGPT, Meta. Like, literally every single major AI company is currently in some sort of major copyright or IP law, or a case, rather. I think that's going to be a huge determining factor of what actually goes on. But to get really back to the point, that there's a lot of these things that are happening all at the same time. Meanwhile, I think personally that there is this really big issue that's happening between what you would call the West Coast and the East Coast, right? And the framing I like to talk about is through that old Kipling quote, right? I mean, Kipling has his problems, but I've always thought that this quote is very indicative and very helpful as a way of framing this problem again, right? That the East is East and the West is West, and then never the twain shall meet. That really, when we're talking about a lot of these problems, I think that to really understand them fundamentally, you really need to think through the fact that there really are multiple different conversations going on in Washington, D.C., in state houses and other centers of power, right? What I think about the East. The focus is on AI. A lot of it is on regulatory scope, legislative action, law, litigation. But in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, fundamentally, it's very, 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 very different, right? There are two different cultures, as the old, C.P. Snow book suggests, right? There are two different cultures that are going on here. One is happening in AI, in the centers of AI. Another is happening in the halls of power. And why I think that's important is because of something I've talked about more than a couple times is, would it even be constitutional when we're talking about some of these laws? There was a suggestion in 2023 actually, but I wrote about it a year later. Would it even be legal to pause AI? This is an idea that was proposed and signed by Elon Musk and a whole bunch of very well-known tech entrepreneurs. But I kind of looked at and went through a bit of the law that currently exists, and admittedly, there's no real strong Supreme Court case. There's a whole bunch of district courts. But fundamentally, like, this is just something whenever I ask somebody about the laws and legislations that they're proposing, would it even be constitutional? And I normally find blank faces, especially when I'm talking to people in Silicon Valley. And the reason why that's important is because if you do care about these things fundamentally, you do need to be attendant to the public policy, right? You do need to know about the law, about the ability and the limits of legislation. And I think that's also a bit of a problem, as you'll see as we start talking about some of these laws, is that if you're not, we're racing ahead to pass a lot of new legislation, but it could bump up against the courts, right? That we could have this really interesting court fight that might happen. We might also be doing things and pushing for legislation and not really understand how this piece of legislation that is passed integrates with the rest of the legal system, which creates very big problems and lots of really big fractions. That's why fundamentally the way I think that we should be thinking about AI is not regulating AI as a tech, but regulating AI uses. We don't really regulate software, right? We don't, there's no like software regulation. We regulate how software is used in finance and health and housing, right? The focus, my personal focus, when we think about these three frameworks, my real thing is that we should be thinking about AI uses and regulating AI uses and not necessarily regulating the technology itself. This has a bit of an old pedigree, interestingly enough. There's a very well-known law professor, Frank Easterbrook. He wrote this piece back in 1996. It was called The Law of the Horse. It's generally called The Law of the Horse, right? And he prefaces this by saying, we didn't develop a law of the horse. We developed all of these other things related to the horse, when technology was advancing from the horse to the car, right? And I think that's a very similar thing that we should be thinking about now, right? And the entire point of his piece, which I'd highly suggest reading, I think it's actually very helpful to reimagine, to rethink, because many of the same conversations we're having now with AI were existing back in the 1990s with cyberspace, as they were calling it, but it really was the internet, right? It was the beginning of the internet in 1996, 1995. And so what he talked through is, what you need to do is develop a sound law of intellectual property and then apply it to computer networks, right? The thing that we need to be thinking about are all of these other the principles that go around the laws that we're trying to enact, and then figure out how they then interact with the uses. That I think is not very well appreciated currently. And I think that what we're seeing, and unfortunately, I think is going to be a big problem in the next coming years, is really these frictions that exist between the states and the federal government, and this idea that we need laboratories of democracy. So, yeah, laboratories of democracy. Right now, I'm hesitant to, obviously we do need laboratories of democracy, but there is this tension I see and a tension that I have within all of this. We take, for example, I kind of suggested at the very beginning, but social media, right? Social media and privacy legislation is something that I think 19 different states have passed. When you look at the different state level implementations of privacy, it is incredibly difficult, even if you're a company like Meta or Google that wants to comply with them, that because of the nature of the internet, right? Because it traverses lines between, between states, that it's incredibly difficult for even these companies who want to be compliant to understand where their compliance truly exists. And so I thought that it was very interesting. I was actually talking with somebody who is a, basically public policy leader. He was one of the chiefs of staff of a major, multi-billion-dollar firm. And he said, speaking about this problem within privacy law, that there's so many different states that are interacting. He said that will be defensible, right? We can defend a lawsuit, but we don't know if we can ever be compliant. And that's because to be compliant is actually very difficult, because they don't know, whenever they send a piece of information through the internet, right? They don't really know how it's going to be routed around through the internet. So if you have multiple different states that are regulating in slightly different ways, right? And the privacy definitions are slightly different in New York than they are for California, that as that information gets routed across the internet, then in fact there are conflicts that they don't know if they'll ever be able to resolve. But at the same time, I think that we do need to be understanding that AI and other technologies are new, and we do need to have some sort of ability to kind of figure out where the tensions lie and whether or not we should apply, this idea, an idea, for example, on safety, or an idea on, say, bias. And so to me, there is this inherent tension that I think that we really, it's okay if these things go unresolved, but fundamentally, this is the tension right now that we're seeing, is this tension between the states and the federal level, and the question of whether or not we really should be emboldening laboratories of democracy, because there truly is a cost, which I'll get into at the very, very end. But what I want to do here is just kind of go through a bit of the last couple of years in what's happened. So I have two slides here trying to go through the history. So October, so almost 3 years ago this month, right? So it was November 30th, November 30th, 2022, ChatGPT 3.5 becomes public. This obviously happened during the Biden administration. And I think what's interesting is that the Biden administration already released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And it's really kind of fascinating to see the total trajectory, right? I've been working in AI issues now for 10 years, effectively, working primarily in early level understandings of AI job loss. There were a lot of reports back in 2013, 2014 that AI is going to take a whole bunch of jobs. And so as somebody who was working in economics, I just did huge deep dives in trying to understand these reports. But what was interesting, especially starting in about 2016, 2017, is you saw more and more interest in doing something on AI, right? But fundamentally, it really is not the AI that we're now very used to. It is not ChatGPT. It was predictive AI. It's algorithms that are used for housing and for loans and for, rentals. So it's a whole bunch of other algorithms that are connected, but are not the same as the AI that we're talking about today. I think that's happy to discuss more about that. But when Obama came into office, one of the things that they ended up working on was this blueprint for AI Bill of Rights that really was all about predictive AI, as we call it, right? So you can separate out predictive AI and generative AI. Predictive AI is the kind of stuff, as I said, civil rights, housing, Fair Credit Reporting Act. Those are mostly in the kind of the predictive space. November 2022 happens, and then within a couple months, ChatGPT reaches 100 million users, becoming the quickest commercial technology that's ever been adopted. And pretty soon after that, then the Biden administration ended up signing their executive order on AI. And by the end of that year of 2023, you had roughly 200 bills that were introduced across state legislatures. More recently, this is really ramped up, right? So February 2024, California's SB 1047 was introduced. We'll be talking about that here in a second. But what's interesting, I think, is also important to note here is, for example, the European Union, they actually adopted their act in 2024. They had to make amendments in 2023 for LLMs because this regulatory structure that they had, which has been adopted and kind of it was also embedded within the, the Biden AI blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, that had this idea, and basically we kind of had this notion of what we should do for AI, and then we applied generative AI on top of it. Pretty quickly within that same year, last year, Colorado's AI Act was signed into law. The California's SB 1047 was eventually, it was passed by the California legislature, and then it was vetoed by Governor Newsom for very specific reasons. But by 2024, we'd seen over 600, something like 650 AI-related bills, 100 of which were enacted. Earlier this year, right, and I'm just thinking about now we're in November, and it feels incredibly close because I remember very clearly when Trump rescinded the Biden executive order and really started this entire new interesting fight that happened beginning this year. I'm going to talk a bit about the AI moratorium, but that happened in May, June, and July. And then July, we have an AI action plan is published. And now currently, I've actually been tracking these. We have about 1,000 bills in the state legislatures across all 50 states. Things have changed very, very, very dramatically. Though there are only a couple different, structurally, there's only a couple different types of these bills. We have basically what we would call study bills, right? We have a group called sectoral regulation, the real things to think about and to focus on are these other two parts, which are the safety and then the bias and fairness bills, which I'll get into here shortly. But first, a bit about the study bills. This is mostly what was happening in 2020, 2023 and 2024. Committees to understand AI. I think that's actually a very good thing to understand, right? You commission reports, you figure out where the gaps are in your legislation, and you start trying to extend or plug those gaps. Right? When we write sectoral legislation, right, there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily apply to AI, but should apply to AI. So, for example, Arizona's SB 1359 prohibits deceptive or fraudulent deepfakes, right? You can't. There's a whole bunch of regulations on what you can say about a candidate, but they just extended that to deepfakes and said you can't do a deceptive deepfake. So you apply the idea, the notion, right? You regulate a use, but you extend it into this new space. So these sectoral laws, a lot of stuff that's been happening, a lot of what's been going on at the state level a lot of them have been extensions of that. The one that I would highlight are the behavioral health laws. This is something I've actually been writing a lot about because it's been interesting to see how this is actually traversed, because you have Utah, which actually did kind of what, as I suggested, right? Utah had limitations on what behavioral and mental health, practitioners and people that were licensed, what they could do. And they basically just said, everything that applies in the real world also applies if you use an AI system, right? We're not going to really change things. Illinois was very different. Illinois basically banned any usage of it. So in Illinois, you cannot use AI to diagnose, treat, or improve an individual's mental health or behavioral health. And the interesting thing about that is, if you think about apps that do this, it is all of your health tracking apps. It's all of your, if you're, as I do, I track my workouts. Anything that is related to like wellness. So, if you're using a wellness app technically does improve a mental health. Right. And so those things would be regulated. I think that this is something I've suggested that they need to clean up. But I think that this is indicative of what we're seeing within the overall state legislatures, which is that these ideas, which potentially could apply and might be good, right? Maybe we do actually want to ban AI for any sort of use within mental health. But perhaps we don't want to include all of these other uses and functions. But because there's this demand and because there's a push that we need to do something on AI, the really important parts of the law are not getting attended to. And so therefore you end up passing something, and this was universally supported. It was signed by the governor. But yet there's very serious questions right now whether or not a whole bunch of these apps would actually be able to exist. And they're probably going to have to go through and rewrite parts of the bill specifically to cut that out. But this, to me, I think is really what we're seeing. And I think this is actually quite indicative of this general problem. The other sorts of things that I would also highlight and that should be interesting is like a new area where I just have never really seen a lot. I mean, there has been kind of interest, but algorithmic pricing, I think, is a very, very, very interesting area. It's something I'm going to actually work on in the next couple of years. It really, you've seen a lot of this, right? Like rental pricing, there's been a whole bunch of cases on whether or not you can use an algorithm for rental pricing. Again, this goes back not to generative AI issues, but much more this old school algorithm, what's called predictive AI. But algorithmic pricing, there's been a whole bunch of new regulations that are going to be coming out. A whole bunch of stuff has already been approved. You know, Illinois had one, Vermont had one on restrictions of dynamic pricing in retail. There's been a whole bunch of these changes that are also coming. So it's something to pay attention to if you're interested in this largely. But for the bulk, what I really think that you should be focused on, and what I really think that is the most important part, are these two types of bills, right? What we call a safety bill, and then maybe like a bias and fairness bill. And to me, there's really two different indicators: SB 1047, which did not pass, and then Colorado's AI bill, which did pass. I think they're very indicative of kind of what we're seeing, broadly speaking, at the state level. So this, you know, as I opened up this conversation with a quote from Scott Wiener. He's the one who pushed this bill, SB 1047. And eventually this did pass, but so this did pass, and then he pressed for a new bill later this year, which did in fact get approved. But this bill, SB 1047, was the first what you call AI safety bill, right? We're concerned about what's going to happen with, say a Terminator scenario, or that these advanced AI technologies are able to open up or able to attack computers, right? That we're worried that these things could help malicious use. And so what we're going to do is we're going to restrict it, right? We're going to put in certain provisions within the law to allow these things to be safe. This did it through what was called the compute threshold, right? So what we end up doing is we say that basically any large model over this certain threshold would be covered by the law. This is like a very wonky definition, but it is actually used pretty consistently. This is actually what the Europeans use, a version of this. But this, at least the 10 to the 26, hasn't been reached yet in the United States. We think the next generation will hit this. The Europeans use one level lower. So basically all the newest technologies currently, so your ChatGPT 5.0, basically all of the current Claude and Anthropic's Claude, like all the 4.0 stuff or the 4.5, that's all regulated under European law. But basically what they end up doing is adding this compute threshold in order to be the way in which you regulate the entity, the AI model. The weird thing, it's also the other way you can kind of do this is also through training dollars, right? So they basically say, if your training runs cost $100 million to run, then you're regulated under this law. I think that's potentially a really interesting problem in the near future as training runs potentially become cheaper and you spend a lot more time on the other end. But needless to say, what was interesting about 1047, the reason I was so interested in it was originally because it had this provision called, to build in a kill switch, right? And I'd written a lot about the legality of pausing AI and even pausing a kill switch. Provisions of this ended up getting kicked out at the very, very end. So it was slightly different. But broadly speaking, this is what a lot of the safety bills look like, right? You have to conduct an annual review. You cannot initiate a covered model training if there remains an unreasonable risk, which is a very, I don't know if you have any lawyers in the room, but reasonableist standard is it's like basically a hole. We don't really know what it means, and it has to be determined by the courts. So I think that what was interesting about this bill in particular is that it added a whole bunch of different things, right? That maybe perhaps on one provision or two provisions we actually would want to do, right? Perhaps we do want to actually have, cybersecurity protections, right? I think that's not a bad idea, right? Obviously, we need cybersecurity protections. What that actually looks like as far as a provision and what the laws look like, I think that matters a lot, right? But perhaps, but then you add in, you have to have a kill switch. Is that legal? That conversation, quite literally, I bring this up consistently. No one really seemed to care whether or not that their bill would be sunk because it was, fundamentally in conflict with the First Amendment. That didn't seem to really get a lot of interest, which again, I would hope that it would, but it is what it is. But fundamentally, there was other things that also existed within SB 1047, which I think were interesting, right? These know your consumer provisions, they actually probably violated the Federal Stored Communications Act. So this is, again, you have these conflicts, right? The states are trying to do certain kinds of bills, but they are fundamentally not being considerate of how they interact with the federal level. And then there's also just this general thing where they just kind of pushed it off to this frontier model division to define the rules. This is actually something we've seen pretty consistently. And it's in fact something that happened with Colorado's AI Act as well. So this is the other major AI Act that I think is kind of indicative, like as a framework. Colorado's AI Act it doesn't really consider itself with safety, right? It's not really worried about cybersecurity attacks or producing kind of the Terminator scenario. What it's actually worried about is how to implement and regulate high-risk artificial intelligence systems that are making consequential decisions. So the first thing I started with, that original law talking about how it would limit Excel, that's basically the framework of what Colorado implemented. It includes a whole bunch of things. So it includes education, employment, financial services, but it doesn't include actually a lot of stuff that are currently being talked about now. So it doesn't include chatbots. It doesn't include anti-fraud and virus tools or AI video games. A whole bunch of stuff that actually is in the conversation right now about being regulated under Colorado's AI Act. They would not have been regulated under that. It was kind of similarly, though, and this is what's interesting, right? It actually kind of similarly had a whole bunch of different sorts of provisions that kind of looked very similar to SB 1047. So there was, specific items, right? It required reviews, impact assessments. These were actually very similar. SB 1047 required something very similar. But what it also included were a whole bunch of other things, right? So making publicly available statements, summarizing the high-risk state or the high-risk uses, providing a consumer with the opportunity to appeal. It included a whole bunch of other things. And I think the real takeaway here is that there's really kind of two ways in which states are considering and regulating AI, and each one of them is slightly different, right? The thing that I saw really about Colorado's AI Act is the problems that occur with actual enforcement. What was interesting to see, and having tracked this now over the last couple of years, Colorado estimated actually a pretty minimal fiscal impact. So I don't know if anyone here really looks at fiscal notes, but typically most states do them. I think 47 states. I know North Dakota does this, right? You have for the big bills, right? You have a fiscal impact statement, generally speaking. Their original fiscal impact suggested that we could do this with, so basically like before a bill is passed, you want to understand like how much is it going to cost for the government to enforce this. They initially said, well, we could do this with existing appropriations, right? And then right before it was passed, they said, it's actually going to cost about $650,000 per year to enforce. Then this year they did a re-estimate, and it's now going to be between 2.5 million to potentially Governor Polis is suggesting about $6 million a year to actually enforce this. They're considering a very major overhaul of this entire system. So the idea is great that you want to protect consumers. And I think that everyone generally agrees with that. But when you get into the black letter of the law, it matters a lot. And this, to me, I think is something that is just not well appreciated. Not surprisingly, Polis is actually one of the few governors to support this idea of an AI moratorium in Congress earlier this year, because it would give Congress time to figure this out. This is probably the biggest thing that's happening right now currently, and the reason why I actually had to update a couple of these slides. So earlier this year, we had this big, huge fight over the AI, what was called the AI moratorium. And this idea is basically that you would have a 10-year, so initially it was going to be about 10 years, right, that you couldn't have very specifically targeted AI legislation in the states. The idea was basically to, and it couldn't be just specifically targeted on AI. Now you could have a whole bunch of stuff for kids' safety. You could have a whole bunch of things for discrimination, but you couldn't be specifically applied, right? It had to be general applicability, as it was known in the provisions. This would have stopped effectively any of those state bills specifically directed. So it would have really stopped most of the safety and AI bills that I was talking about earlier. This became an interesting fight because originally there was an agreement. It went through the reps, And then Marjorie Taylor Greene, NTG, started really making a whole bunch of hay about it. That then ended up, Steve Bannon on one of his shows ended up really talking about this issue, and it basically killed the moratorium. Where the reason why this to me is a very important piece of the entire conversation, because what's effectively happened is that this moratorium, the AI moratorium during the Big Beautiful Bill, One Big Beautiful Bill, really has changed around the politics at the federal level on all of this, right? So you have somebody like Jared Polis who really sees fundamentally, hey, you know, he was kind of forced actually to sign the bill. You know, the state leaders basically said, if you don't get your housing bill, you know, if we don't get our Colorado AI bill, then you're not going to get your housing bill, because he wanted the housing bill. He approved the AI bill and had the most interesting signing letter and basically said, I don't think that this is a good bill, but I'm signing it anyway. And that's because, I mean, effectively it was politics. He wanted to get his housing bill finished, but he also understood implicitly, he's one of the, I think he's actually a very good, it was very sad to actually see him sign the bill, because he's been in Congress before, right? He was a congressional member, and he was, I think, one of the better tech people, right? He had done a whole bunch of really important provisions and laws over the last couple of years. But he really has seen that there is it's very difficult to actually do this in practice, right? That we have very high level notions of where we should protect consumers, but when it gets into the nitty gritty, there's a whole bunch of conflicts when you actually try to mandate a a bias and fairness bill, as they're generally called, for the state level. However, this is back. So literally earlier this week on Monday, I heard about this late last week. The House is currently eyeing AI preemption in DAA, right? So for those who don't know too much about laws, there's really only a couple must-pass pieces of legislation. The NDAA is one of them. All right, this is the Defense Act. That's the National Defense Authorization Act. This has to happen every single year for the defense budget. The reason why it's important is because, again, it's a must-pass piece of legislation, and sometimes if you can get agreement between everyone together, that you then can pass something that, you know, people don't like it because it's like log rolling, or it's putting something within, you know, other piece of legislation. But when you only have so many vehicles that must pass, oftentimes this will become an area of conflict. So that was on Monday, and then what date is that? The 19th, so Wednesday, it was then released that the White House might do an executive order on preemption. So that was 2 days ago, right? It seems right now that probably the NDAA is dead, but probably also the executive order is dead. It's interesting to really be somebody who's been working on these issues, and quite literally in a span of a week, you know, literally a couple days, to then be presented with the fact that we may get, in fact, an AI piece of legislation, right? We don't have a federal privacy bill, but there was a moment where I was considering the fact that we would have a federal AI bill and not a federal privacy bill. The federal privacy bill has been fought over for many, many, many years. But I think what Trump was really suggesting and thinking about through this, and specifically through the EO has been pushed back, that, you know, he would use his power to basically preempt the states, and that would then give basically a forcing function event to then cause the legislators to come together on NDAA and basically have an AI bill. I never thought that, you know, I was skeptical, because unlike the, you know, so I've talked a little bit about privacy and social media. There's been kind of large scale agreement on what that should look like for many, many, many years. The real tension has just been on basically like 2 points within privacy, within a national privacy bill. We just don't see that within AI bills. That really, we see this tension between safety, right? People who want to do something on the Terminator scenario for AI and for ChatGPT, as compared to people who want to do something on algorithmic bias, you know, reducing certain high risk categories. And those two things really, there's not there's not a lot of agreement on what a bill should look like that combines those two. And I think that is the reason why you aren't seeing a lot of agreement on what a federal privacy bill should be. But we'll see what happens with the executive order. The executive order, at least it seems today, as I was reading, that it probably is going to get pushed back past Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, state legislators are gearing up for massive battles this next year. I am also kind of gearing up for massive battles next year. There's a whole bunch that's going to happen. So again, going back to the the pricing stuff that we talked about and a bit on the behavioral health, I think is going to be a big issue. So all of these areas that we've talked about, safety and bias and fairness, all of these things are going to be coming ahead this next year. The politics are very, very different. Virginia, for example, had a bill that was passed. Virginia had a Republican governor. Now they have a Democratic governor. And so I don't imagine that the same bill that basically didn't pass the governorship last year is going to do the same this year. Probably will get passed. If you're interested in this, happy to talk more about it. I would suggest, however, which is something I've suggested to all of my RAs and former students, do vote counting. It is really tough, but put out a spreadsheet, because it's not illegal, thankfully, and figure out every single individual that would support a committee or be on the committee, and actually figure out how they're voting, or like just try to give them a number, right? They're like probably a yes or probably a no or kind of uncertain. When you actually start doing that and forcing yourself to think through this structurally, and I don't think a lot of people do politics structurally enough, right? That it has to go through committee system, right? Generally speaking, it has to go through committee system, but it's all of those things that really combine together, right? The committee systems, it has to go through one house, right? You have to have agreement generally with the leadership. So start trying to, if you're interested actually in politics, the thing I would suggest is do vote counting, right? Figure out, if it's a piece of legislation that's in the environment and you care a lot about energy and the environment, who are the people that are leading the energy environment committees, right? And how can that thing then go up or trickle through the committee process, then up through, say, the House and through the Senate? Doing this for every single state is incredibly difficult. It's something I'm trying to actually automate. And that brings me to my last part, which is using LLMs for cost compliance. I think this to me is probably an area where it's something I'm working on pretty extensively. And I think that a lot of these tools, what's so cool about them is you can really do quick coding. You can do a lot of really interesting things very, very quickly. But this project, generally speaking, came from this idea that I saw, or this paper I saw late last year. This is generative agent simulations of 1,000 people. And what really, really struck me about this is that they were getting the General Social Survey, right? So the General Social Survey is this long-standing poll that University of Chicago's done. They got it accurate to about 85% of the time. That's fascinating, right? So they did extended surveys and asked questions of individuals. Each one of those then was created a persona, a profile, and then they asked the questions they asked them questions of those profiles, and they were actually pretty good when it came to the surveys. I think this is going to be a really interesting area for especially researchers like myself to understand how things are moving. But I think that fundamentally what I really wanted to understand is, what if we applied this idea to regulatory cost estimates? I do a lot of cost compliance estimates. So I just asked, I asked ChatGPT, act as a compliance officer at a regulated company, and assess these provisions. And then it provided me, and I basically pulled together all the material. It provided me this really kind of interesting graph, right? Which is, you'll notice here that these are 3 different provisions. These are, so we have data on these, right? So you have, the first one is a risk assessment provision that was done by California. The second one was an automated decision-making technology regulation done by California. And the last one was this BIS rule. So we have this data, and that's what's on the first line on each one of them, right? Which is so for the first 2, which are from California, right, the standardized regulatory impact assessment the first year and in the subsequent years. So we have official state data on what the estimates should be. And then I re-asked the exact same question using the exact same provisions of the law to see what the LLM suggested. What's interesting about this, I think, is that, the LLMs weren't they're not like perfect, but they're not like completely out of bounds, right? ChatGPT for the first year is, kind of right in the middle of where it suggested what the cost would be, is exactly what the official estimates were. And you see, especially for that second California law, which is under the ADMT section, right? It actually put it at a little bit less. So what's interesting is we're seeing is that these regulatory, the LLMs are kind of getting relatively close to official numbers. What's actually very different is that the subsequent year numbers are almost completely, they're almost always larger. And I think that was very, very indicative of the problem, because typically when you do these standardized regulatory impact assessments or like these official numbers from the government, that you basically just kind of, you take them as a percentage. And that's not really that good, right? Because you may do something initially and you'll have like initial costs, but your fixed costs are actually, they're not just a pure percentage. They actually have certain kinds of requirements. From here, I then took it, obviously, as because I'm an economist, you do discounted regulatory cost analysis. So you figure out what the actual cost is fundamentally. Right, so this is done over 10 years, done with a 2% discount rate, very, very common, right? This is a common way to do cost impact assessment. And I think what these showed is that, you know, these are the SIRAs and then the ADMTs. This is from California. This really showed that the estimates from the standardized regulatory impact assessment, because they do kind of a couple of these, right? They do scenario analysis, right? They basically say, well, it could cost this or it could cost this. They do a high level and a low level. But what we're showing and what's interesting is that basically a lot of these provisions are pretty close, but the bounds are much, 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 much larger. My work in the next couple months is actually going to be to go through and to redo this. So this is something I'm currently doing, right? You basically make what are called personas. You say, hey, the industry is, you know, you differ between the industry, right? The industry, say, is retail or is compared to technology. It has different kinds of resources. You have, say, an in-house legal counsel. And then what you can do is you can take this with what we know with what's going on in an actual state or in the federal government, and we can start narrowing all this down and doing a whole bunch of fine tuning. So one of the big projects I'll have in the beginning of next year is taking a couple different looks at this, right? And trying to get better and better such that we actually get pretty close estimates to what the official numbers suggest. But I think that we really can be doing and using a lot of these technologies much, much more broad-based, especially people that work in, you know, in business. I think is a really, really interesting opportunity to use surveys, active surveys, to ask your local businesses and say, hey, like, you know, here's what it looks like. You ask them and you do the kind of the, you know, initial report that I suggested here. And that way you can actually do something very, very localized, right? That if you have a new tax provision that comes in or you have a new regulatory provision, you can actually have something that's incredibly local to your community or to your state. Happy to talk about this further, but that's the end of this. And I know I've thrown a lot at everyone, and I think we have about 10 minutes. So yes, happy to take questions.
Please raise your hands.
Thank you, Mr. Rinehart.
Yeah.
If you would, can you go back to the Biden executive order from 22, compare that to the Trump outline that was issued in 25, and then tell me who advised these presidents in this matter?
Yeah. So Biden's the Biden executive order, the guy who mainly wrote the executive order under Biden is a guy named Ben Buchanan. The big difference between I mean, there's multiple differences between President Biden's executive order and then Trump's executive order. Biden's executive order, one of the big things that is a big difference, and one of the issues I had with it is that it used basically what's called the Defense Production Act, the DPA. And so it used that authority, and this is typically for like surveys. This is a bill that was passed during the Korean War that was meant to, you know, energize the use of local industry for the Korean War. What's interesting about that is that he took the furthest extent that you could for that bill and said, if you're an AI, you know, a big model provider, right? If you're ChatGPT or Claude, you have to provide surveys. You have to provide every 4 months. You have to provide us information about what your models are doing, right? What's interesting about that got a lot of consternation, and it was actually the BIS rule that I mentioned at the very, very end, right? That the provision that we do have regulatory analysis for, because the state itself, or I'm sorry, the federal government went through and did analysis to see how much that providing information on what your models are doing anytime your model updates, that was actually pretty costly. I mean, at least we can look at the numbers. All that's to say is that I think that the big difference between the executive order from Biden really is the extent at which it was using the authority of the Defense Production Act to push for understanding of what's going on with frontier models. There were other things that were clearly different between the two. Another big thing that I think that really where the Trump administration kind of flubbed was they didn't create very specific timelines. So with President Biden, there was like, I think something like 180 different reports that had to be created, and a lot of that was just figuring out where the gaps exist. So a whole bunch of stuff on financial regulation, and for example, what the FTC could do, as far as regulatory provisions were concerned. But all that stuff has been produced, and that's actually most of it's still online. So what's interesting about the differences between the two. So once Trump came into office, he got rid of it. Literally, second day, he got rid of the executive order. What we have now is actually it's not that different, interestingly enough, except for those Defense Production Act provisions. They look very, very similar, right? They're suggesting we should do quick permitting for data center use. That was something that Biden had also suggested. It was kind of a whole of government approach, right? The big difference between the two, I think, would be immigration, right? Obviously, there's nothing basically on immigration in Trump's provision, whereas there was a lot of suggestions within the Biden executive order. But I think the broader way to think about this is that executive authority is actually somewhat limited on what it can do, right? I was working with them trying to think through what their next round of regulatory actions could be, because they just put it out, or they just closed their a recent kind of deregulatory docket, as it's called. And I think what's interesting is just that a lot of stuff you'd actually want to do is going to have to be approved by Congress. So fundamentally, there are changes that really are pretty distinctive between the two, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but they kind of look very, very similar in nature. The big thing was Defense Production Act. The other thing I would say is just how it was framed. So the Biden executive order was all about safety and about protecting AI use, whereas the Trump administration executive order, which was called the Action Plan, was all about competition with China. So the competitive, just the rhetoric of them is very, very different. But I think it's still kind of limited on what exactly they can do, and they're very, very similar in kind of in results, interestingly enough.
Oh, this is all real interesting and significant. And I think we're all worried about China. I think you started to touch on that. What's it like there? Are they regulating this? Do they have different provinces versus the Communist Party that gets involved like we are? How are we going to fare with that?
That's actually very astute. Yeah, the Chinese system, I've been trying to understand it. I've been spending as much time trying to learn as much as I can about the Chinese system, really since COVID. I think there's a pretty big distinction. They have followed. I think that the way to think about this is that they, in the United States, we focus a lot on artificial general intelligence, right? That's partly the reason why there's a lot of discussion about safety, because all the big AI companies are really trying to push for a system that would be considered an artificial general intelligence, an AGI, right? That's not really the focus of China. China, when you look at their documents, and I would highly suggest reading I think it was the People's Daily, where they actually, everything's in English. They say very, very explicitly what they're doing, and it's very interesting to read every once in a while, read what they're saying about these things. The way that they understand AI is much more of like an industry, kind of an industry multiplier, right? That they don't see it as this race to AGI. And in fact, in most of the documents, you will never see an AGI or artificial general intelligence as the comment. What they see is implementing AI in manufacturing, implementing it in semiconductors, implementing it within telecommunications. And then they also have a very explicit exportation understanding. So they very much want to export their ideas and their use cases to other countries, particularly into Africa is a big one that they've been pushing for recently, and also within their own region. But I think that the perception, especially of the Chinese, is that because we're so focused on really the most advanced tech, they feel like they can kind of let us make our own mistakes, and then You know, they're actually, a lot of their regulatory bodies are actually very risk adverse. They do have an AI, kind of an AI regulatory system. It kind of looks similar, but it doesn't have really any of the safety provisions. And, you know, who really knows what it's going to look like as far as bias and implementation, because those things in the Chinese context just look very, very different. But I think what's interesting about China is they really do want us to be making the mistakes first, and they really are kind of taking a quick, whenever you see something that's going on in the United States, usually China is behind us 6 months. And I also think that it's not well appreciated that China's implementation is just at a different level, right? They talk a big game about AI implementation, and there's some really important leaders, but they're constrained on a whole bunch of ways, right? They're primarily constrained on semiconductors and data centers, right? They cannot have, we've restricted chips, and because we have restriction on chips, they can't really, right? They can't really build the data centers that they probably would want. But I also don't think that the demand on the Chinese consumer side is as large as everyone thinks it is, right? I think the best way to think about this is, I forget, I think it was Greg Ip, he, you know, former Washington Post writer, writer in the Washington Post. He does economics. You know, he suggests that 5% of what the Chinese economy is doing is leading edge. The last 50% is just a nutcase, right? And I think that's actually very indicative of what's going on in the economy. 5% is incredibly advanced. There's about half of it that is really got a lot of problems. And that 5% can do a lot of really important work. The other thing I would suggest, as I've been suggesting, and you know, to legislators and to Congress this last week, is that we really do need to keep these lines of communication open. China, and especially some of these advanced frontier companies in China, have done some really, really important work. This is DeepSeek. Happy to talk about this a little bit later. But what DeepSeek showed is actually some of these technologies that have been kind of on the shelf for a little while can be used very, very effectively. That is now just being implemented into frontier companies. They're using this for better training. So, you know, ChatGPT, a lot of their newer systems are trying to implement some of those tools. And I think it's that as long as we keep those lines of communication open, and I think the Chinese are kind of forced to because of their, you know, limitations on data centers. As long as that continues, I think that consumers, and especially American companies, will continue to benefit in an interesting sort of way.
Okay, other questions? Oh.
Yeah. When it comes to the topic of AI regulations, in general, we think about data privacy, trust, security, all these things. But there are some regulatory blind spots related to human cognitive thinking, and like, you know, regulation related to the decision-making capacity based on the algorithm results and all. So is this blind spots be taken into consideration when you design any AI regulation policies? Example, right now we have EU AI policy, and then California state law AI regulation, and other policies and all. But we are missing, in recent times, we have studies by the researchers about usage of AI is reducing the cognitive effect of human brain thinking. In that aspect, how do we cover these regulations to address these points?
So that, oh goodness. Yeah, the cognitive question is really, really fascinating because it depends I would say that a lot of those studies are super, super, super early. And it really does depend on where you're at in the what you might call the educational ladder, right? So for high achieving students in particular, right, it actually seems to do it increases their abilities pretty dramatically. The only really great study on this was looking at high school students prepping for a college, like a Parley Pro college debate session. Their use of AI seems to have actually increased their ability to compete because they understood what was going on. As far as substitution effect is for cognition, that I'll be honest, I'm kind of skeptical of that, to be very, very honest. Those reports, I think, are we really just don't have a lot of great data what's going on in education. And what we have seen traditionally in a whole bunch of other educational opportunities, especially with video, and I know like the internet and online teaching, it basically creates, some students do really well, some students do really poorly, right? It increases that curve. I think what's interesting about AI systems now is that there's the possibility that we actually could match students with their capabilities for educational opportunities. So that's on the education side. As far as, workers who are using this to basically substitute out their jobs, that also I think is a little difficult to see, because most everything that we've seen so far in consumer support, in productivity when it comes to programmers, and then writing and lawyers, we've seen basically skills, every single skill, almost in every single report, and there's only one that this doesn't exist in, that people who are novices basically are lifted dramatically, right? They're lifted up. The big thing is that people who are on the very, 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 very top end, and I think this is where a lot of people are really focusing on, people who are at the absolute frontier, it actually seems to harm them. So that is actually the case, right? Those studies are actually, the big one that's about this is only about 16 people. So I'm a little bit skeptical of it. It made a lot of waves. It was produced by what's called Meta. It's a very, very well-known AI system, or AI tracking company. So that I'm almost 100% sure that's the one you're talking about. That I think is just, it needs to be understood it needs to be understood on its own terms. The one thing I would say about that report, and I know we're butting up against time, is that what I think is very, very interesting about that report. So again, it only asked basically the best programmers to use an AI system, but it then asked them to predict how well the AI system how well that they were doing with the AI system. So after they did all their programming, they did these programming study. They said, oh yeah, it boosted me by 20%, when in fact it declined their productivity by 19%. And everyone else then said as well, right, that experts in machine learning and economists said, oh yeah, it's going to boost like 20 to 30%. So it's very, very interesting that people who are even using these technologies that are on the bleeding edge don't really understand how well it is that they're using them. And I think that's actually something that, we were talking about earlier, the reports like that. I think that's like it's a very interesting sort of result. And it's something that over time, as we just get better about this, because again, we're only 3 years out on this technology, that we're going to understand actually, perhaps there's certain ways to teach students, right? And to have multiple, I'm still of the world that I had a whole bunch of multiple questions. It was just pure numbers, right? Starting off in engineering, it was a numbers game. You did 20 questions, every single week for weeks and weeks on end, and it was just rote memorization. I have a feeling that we're probably going to get back to that, as we realize that there really is only a couple ways of teaching education, but there's more interesting ways to get students involved in learning those sorts of programs. Perhaps they could be talking about something they care about, or a topic they care about. I found a lot of students, and even, parents are also trying to do this as well, to try to figure out ways to teach their kid in more interesting ways. I wish I had a lot of these tools. I still watch, I watch a whole bunch of these programs online of like stuff that, mathematics and science and computation, super, super fascinating. And my expectation is that as these tools and systems get better, hopefully we're going to get better on education, but I think the demand also has to be there as well. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the afternoon session. We had two great presentations this morning, and we're going to have an excellent panel discussion this afternoon. It's going to be led by Dr. Jeremy Straub. Jeremy Straub is a senior fellow at the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth and an associate professor of computer science at North Dakota State University. His research focuses on the intersections between technology and policy in both artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. He is the lead inventor on 2 U.S. patents and has published over 50 journal articles and hundreds of conference papers. He's a member of multiple professional societies, including the American Society for Engineering Education and SPIE. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Security Agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and other sources. He is the Associate Director of the Institute for Cybersecurity Education and Research. And again, thanks for sticking with us this afternoon. I'm excited about the panel discussion. We actually have a new member here, Taya Spelhaug, and she'll introduce herself as well. But let's all welcome Jeremy Straub and all of our panelists.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us here today. And the first thing that I want to do, as John just kind of alluded to, is give everybody on the panel an opportunity to introduce themselves. I know obviously for those that have been here the whole day, two of our panelists may look somewhat familiar, but just in case we have people tuning in or that have walked in since then, if you want to just kind of briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll give Taya an opportunity to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Revana Sharfuddin. I'm a research fellow. I do labor economics and labor policy research at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. It's good to be here.
Hot mic. Here we go. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Taya Spelhaug, and I am the site director for Microsoft Fargo here in Fargo. And I've been with Microsoft for 8 years. In my previous role, I did Microsoft Philanthropies, so worked with computer science education in the state, also cybersecurity, and now in this little thing called AI. So as I've been told, or been telling a lot of people, I know a little about a lot. So if I'm not able to answer your questions, there's some other really smart people on the panel as well. But also just try to give you some general information about what we're doing at Microsoft and how this is also affecting what we're doing here in Fargo. So thanks so much for the opportunity. It's really great to be here.
Hi, I'm Will Rinehart. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I work on tech and innovation policy with the focus on AI, but I'm kind of a generalist and I've been working in tech and innovation space for now 15 years. So happy to take any questions that anyone's going to pose our way.
All right, well, with that, I'll come up with a All righty, I guess I'm going to be leaning into the mic here. I said what I was going to say is with that, I'll come up with some really difficult ones now that you've committed to answering anything. But in all honesty, our first question here, and we're going to start off with 2 or 3 kind of quick questions, then go to a question or two that was sent in from people online during the previous presentations. Then we'll go to some audience questions both here and online. But our first question is, AI is already having a significant impact on society, or significant impacts on society. Are regulations keeping up with the technology? And what advice would you give to policymakers about what they should be doing in this space? Am I supposed to take that? Well, it's to everybody. Okay. Everybody, anybody.
I would say fundamentally that there is a benefit in waiting for legislators. That when you think about AI, I talked a little bit about this in my presentation, but there's a lot that's happening right now, right? We're seeing at least 50 some cases related to IP issues. There's hundreds of different regulatory actions. There's a lot that's going on. So as much as people want to try to get involved, my suggestion right now is that there is value in a wait and see approach. Economists talk about this as a real option, right? Like when you're thinking about investments, right? Investment is this really expensive thing that you can be involved in, and so therefore there's a benefit in waiting to see if the environment changes. And when you think about, I think that there's a corollary here with regulation as well, right? That when we talk about regulation, that there's a value in waiting for it, a value in waiting to see how things kind of shake out. So as much as people do want to be the first to regulate, there is a lot of benefit, I think, to being basically second best, right? Or being the second to bat. I don't think that that's very attractive for a lot of people politically, right? They want to be seen as doing something, and I think the political forces, the way that they are, they really do kind of suggest that, and really do make it. They do disallow that sort of the kind of wait and see approach, but. My suggestion would be focus on the gaps, right? Focus on the things that exist, right? There are areas where we could probably extend authority, and also figure out your own enforcement actions. And if you're a legislator who's looking at this, or you're in the governor's office, right? You want to think about where you have gaps in enforcement. And I think that's actually something that most people don't do. Or some states are doing this currently, but not all of them.
Yeah, I think we are just having fun up here. So I think obviously Microsoft has been very involved in policy for years. We are a 50-year-old company. AI has been around for probably longer than that. And we have been dealing with AI policy since the beginning. We have been heavily involved in looking at federal legislation, especially around what it looks like in broad swaths. So right now, there's probably 23 different states that have different AI policies. So just think about being a small business owner and what that looks like, especially if your business is cross state lines. So what does that look like if you have a policy in the state that you're in, but you're selling to another state that has a different policy? What policy do you follow? How do you even manage that? When you're looking at being a customer, what are my rights as a person who lives in North Dakota but buys something from California? You know, those are things that we're looking at. So Microsoft has been involved in looking at an overall, if there are going to be regulations, that it should be federal, that we should have something at the federal level, because it just makes things so much easier. You know, the EU has a lot of their own policies, and you know, Great Britain has their own policies. Like, there's just all these different, you know, really strong policies that we've been, and we're a global company, so we are involved in all of those different regulations and policies, and something that we've been doing, I think, a great job at looking at what is that, how do we be a trusted partner in all of these different countries, all of these different states, with the products that we're building. Because, you know, when we're building AI products, we have to look at all the regulations that are out there throughout the world, if we're going to land them in those different countries. So it's something that we're very passionate about. It's something that I think our group has done really well for many, many years.
I was wondering if my microphone would get upset again. I think all the points you both made are just excellent, but also this gives us an opportunity to look at kind of outdated regulations are having sitting in our tax codes, in our businesses, getting in the ways of our businesses to flourish. And this is something I mentioned during my presentation. And a policy brief I recently published, it looks into the tax code and the bottlenecks we have in our tax code, the disincentive for businesses to invest in human capital. So some of the proactive things we can do is think about not only just a solution for AI revolution, for any technology. How do we think about a resilient workforce? How do we think about a workforce that is prepared for the dynamic economy, that is able to absorb skill, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking that makes American economy very unique and strong? And that would be one way to achieve that. And you talked about the small business aspect of it, and small businesses or non-employer businesses are the largest entrepreneurial sector in our economy, and that is close to, I think, over 70% of our businesses are small businesses. And technically, due to our tax code, they're not able to expense the cost they invest in their worker training. If an individual owns more than 5% of their business, they cannot expense their worker training. So if you are an owner of a mom and pop shop and you're just training your daughter for some AI tool to create some, you know, media materials or some marketing materials, you should be able to expense that training, because technically now you're able to expense the cost of AI. So there is a mismatch. And we can think about these outdated provisions. Some of the provisions make no sense. There is a minimum education there's a cap on how much education expense you can get, and it's set in the 1970s. It's $5,000 only, and now in today's dollars, it's actually $15,000. But it didn't keep pace with the inflation and the modern cost of education. So these are some of the things we can do, and these are pro-growth policies because they're expensing and not tax credit, so they're tax neutral, and this is government giving the power back to the businesses to make their choices. This is not government picking winners and losers. So it can adapt to local market conditions. It's not distortionary. So these are some things we can do proactively that is pro-growth, that supports free market, and that supports business. And meanwhile, we need to assess the impact. I don't think we should jump and make some really heavy policy without understanding. And in my presentation, I talk about how much we have learned about the effects in the workforce via AI. And we learned some things, and there's a lot more to learn. So I think meanwhile, when we have some information, let's think about tools. Let's go with the scissor, a smaller tool, and think about tax expensing provision before we jump with the machete. And we should learn before how it's affecting the labor market, and we can think about other tools.
Jeremy, can I jump in just a little bit more? Just kind of want to make sure that little caveat with when I said that we're in favor of federal policy, it depends on the policy too. Like, I mean, we don't want to over regulate ourselves. We are in a AI race with another country that probably won't have a lot of policies. And so we don't want to over-regulate that staples innovation. And so we're always in the frame of mind that we need to have everybody at the table. So it can't just be people in DC that are making these regulations. It has to be everybody that is working with AI, which is literally everybody these days, being part of those conversations on how is this going to really unfold, but making it in a way that is simplified, that encourages innovation and doesn't stifle it.
All right. Here we go again. Excellent. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the next question, which is AI is having notable changes on the workforce as well. So kind of dovetailing into some of the things that we just discussed a second ago. What advice would each of you have for those currently in the workforce? And what advice would you have for students preparing to enter the workforce within the next few months or years?
This is some of the things would probably be a bit of repetition of my earlier presentation. I think when we look at headlines, it looks scarier than when we look at the aggregate economy. The headlines numbers are picked from some plants or some like Amazon workers being laid off and things of that sort. But when we just received the jobs report, that was from September, we didn't have it before because of government shutdown. Bureau of Labor Statistics released it. And people had really negative outlook on the economy, but turns out the economy added over 100,000 jobs just in September. So things are, everybody says that all the economists say that in every new advent of a new technology is that diffusion takes a lot of time. And I remember Nobel laureate Bob Solo's quote from the 80s is that computerization is everywhere except for the productivity data. So I think AI is a lot on the media, but still needs time to show up in actual labor data where there's much more to see. But it's understandable for recent graduate anxieties, and we see that part we see in employment data, not with AI, but there is issues with a recent graduate unemployment rate. So I think staying ahead of the curve and not competing with AI and making it your friend and learning as much as you can with these technologies are going to be something that's going to be helpful, but also thinking about entrepreneurial aspects of things. If white-collar jobs are not future, maybe creating jobs is the future, and you have your businesses, and we know that small businesses can be really empowered with AI tools. And I don't want to go out of my expertise and give career advice because that's not my job, but just to have an outlook on the economy, what the aggregate labor data shows is that things are moving slower than we think from the headlines.
Great question, and something that we work on quite a bit within Microsoft TechSpark, and then also we have a program that just launched called Microsoft Elevate that is all around skilling. But I'm going to go back to kind of the last point on around students. I have 2 nephews and a niece who all go here, and one thing I told them right away, I said, anything that you can learn about AI, do it. Is if there's a club, join it. If there's a class, take it. If there's anything that is around AI, I want you to learn. One, she's going to social work. The other one, he's in precision ag, so he's going to get it all the time. Another one is an ag business. And so, there's going to be a lot of, there's already been in the last couple of years, disruptions in industry. There's going to be even more. And it's just going to get outpace the pace that we are currently at dramatically in the future. And so I said, those are things that you need to learn. AI is not going to take your job. It's somebody who knows AI that could take your job. I'm sure everybody has heard that. And maybe you talked about it. I want to hear I'm going to listen to your talk next time that when that gets launched. But, so I said, it's very critical that you're understanding AI. I am also part of several advisory boards in higher ed, and that is one thing that I have said, wearing my Microsoft hat, around curriculum building. I said your curriculum building should have AI embedded in throughout your curriculum. It really shouldn't just be a standalone class. It really should be asking your students to use AI in responsible ways. And I think oftentimes education gets really worried about the use of AI because people don't necessarily understand how to use it in a responsible way. So if we make this the norm, if we teach people how to use it responsibly, those can be dramatic improvements and innovations that our students can use. So just being able to have those conversations with our students, but then also our university systems on how are we preparing our students. When we're looking at innovation and how things are going to be moving in the next few years, I've also told my nieces and nephews that you're going to be a lifelong learner. Like, that used to be a buzzword. That used to be something that you would go to a professional development class on and they would say, be a lifelong learner. Well, no, that is just going to be something that you're going to need to be. And you can use Copilot on your phone to be a lifelong learner. You can use AI to learn how to do new things and transform who you want to be very, very quickly if you're able to use the systems. So if you don't understand something, you have all the tools right now in your pocket to understand that. So use it and become skilled at it. And, when we talk about AI diffusion, worldwide education and skilling come last after being able to get the technology. You have to have an area where there's electricity. You have to have an area where there's internet. And then you have to learn how to use it in order for diffusion, AI diffusion, to really take hold, and any technology diffusion to take hold. So, we have made significant investments over the years to help worldwide learning on using AI in order to help that diffusion in those areas that are now being supported with technology and internet access.
One of the things that actually Revana mentioned in her presentation was this idea of durable skills. We call them durable skills now. And that's really, I think, where most people should be focusing their attention. This is coordination, communication, collaboration, working with other people. One of the more interesting things I've seen in the last, I've been doing this work now for 10 years, especially since COVID. I think there's a lot of hesitation for people to do cold calls and to even get cold emails. I would get cold emails all the time right before COVID, and now it seems that people just don't want to do it. I do this all the time, right? Maybe you only get like 1 out of 5 responses, but being proactive and just going out and talking with people, I think, is something that's a bit of a lost art, especially with people who are younger, unfortunately. The other thing we talked about was the canaries in the coal mine paper, which is what, Revana had talked about that in her presentation, which I think is the best out of all of the papers and really is, I think, leading the way and is hugely informative to this discussion, right? It really shows that it seems that there probably are some frictions that exist with very specific individuals, 22 to 25, and in very specific AI affected industries, primarily probably software development and then consumer outreach. I think what the interesting thing is, right, we still kind of are unsure right now what's actually going on, but my best guess is that it's a friction problem, right? That as people who work in AI are able to use AI, right, both employers and workers are both using AI, that are normal signals that, hey, I'm dedicated to this job, that they're getting diluted. Say a couple years ago, before ChatGPT, if you wanted to apply to a job, you'd have to tailor your resume. I had to tailor my resume, and you'd spend like an hour or 2 hours to do this. Now it can be done in, say, 10 minutes. And it's that kind of indication, right, that it's just made everything cheaper for everyone, which is again, it's made everything noisier. It's made the entire employment market much noisier. The way to solve that, right, is to then signal, right, as an economist, it's like the way to signal is that I can, that I have things that I can do that no one else can do, right? It's like hard to game features, right, or hard to game qualities. So that includes projects, right? Hey, the one thing that I'm really, again, surprised with is a lot of students, I wrote a paper, I did a project, none of that's online, none of that's through Substack, none of that's accessible. And it's those sorts of things that I was doing. Again, I was doing this 15 years ago when I was trying to find my first job. I had everything online. I had everything, all of my papers that I'd ever written for all of my classes, I had those all online. And that was the reason I got my first job. They noticed it, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but it showed that I had interest in doing these things. And again, that kind of like being active, I think, is something that people really should be focusing on. That if you really do want to separate yourself out from the rest of individuals who are out there, you really just need to signal and show that, hey, I am a high quality individual. That's the kind of stuff, even as I'm looking for people, for our jobs, like that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for. Are they actually interested in this? Even if you're not perfect, right? Even if maybe I disagree with you, at least you're trying. And I think that that's something that, again, I don't see a lot of people doing nowadays. I would hope it happens more consistently, but anyway.
So I guess we'll go to a question now from somebody online, which is a question about the impact of AI on the construction industry. So if there's anybody that would like to speak to that or to other related industries, I'm sure that would be of interest potentially to our person asking the question.
Sure. I've actually been looking at this and tracking where this exists. Construction industry is at a pretty low level. The best data, it's not really that great, but the best data that exists out there is it's done through the Business Trends and Outlook Survey. It's BTOS. So it does industry level, industry level and metro level data analysis on how consistently you're using LLM products. And this is, includes, machine learning, visual, video, chatbots, all that kind of good stuff. Construction's, it's not at the very, very lowest level, but it's towards the bottom. I think it's like right around 10% of the entire industry that's using it. Again, that's a really blunt average, but when you compare it against, say, services, right? Services is in like the 40% range. And then when you look at information services, right? So you look at technical and scientific services, that is, 40-ish% range. And then if I'm remembering this correctly, the information services is incredibly high. It's like in the 60 or 70% range. Overall, construction's doing better than the average, but it's only slightly doing better than on average. And that's because that what you've seen also, which was kind of hinted at some of the earlier conversations, is that the industries that are using and kind of demanding AI level products and large language models, LLMs, and these other advanced tools, they're just very different than what we've traditionally seen with robotics, right? Robotics has traditionally been in food and manufacturing and construction. Those areas which are heavy in robotics tend to actually not be super heavy when it comes to LLM and AI usage. So to me, I've always separated out the two, right? That there is actually kind of an interesting bifurcation between the two, that the industries that are using robotics and that need robotics are much more, physical, whereas the things that are using these kind of AI tools that are potentially very disruptive, those are much more in scientific information, right? They're the more office clerical jobs as compared to the construction and manufacturing jobs.
Yeah, I think I definitely see similar trends with Anthropic Economic Index, or also OpenAI has published a paper where they anonymized the data of the users and matched it with ONET data and to see occupation and industry level. And you see manufacturing, construction to be on the lower end, and something people colloquially have been saying a lot, the knowledge economy, if you want to say it that way, that is the field that's being affected more. And the interesting thing about all of this is things that need dexterity, movement, just tacit knowledge of, like, if you have a bowl and you have to crack an egg And we just do it, right? But if you have to codify it, you have to think about every little move of how you crack an egg. A human going through construction site or driving a car and so on, we just automatically do so many of these things. But when you have to automate this, it's so many layers of trial and error. And something that comes up in some types of automation that I talked about radiology before, that the benchmark AI tools do so much better, but when you bring it to the real environment, it needs a human support all the time. So you can probably see similar effects for construction and manufacturing and so on. For AI to get more involved in these fields, you need robotics to match up with AI. You need an AI embedded in a robot, and the type of dexterity, tacit knowledge that comes with a human worker, it's probably going to take a long, long time. So those industries seem like are going to be largely unaffected for short to medium term, to the very least. And it's really amazing how much if you have to automate something, you really have to change the environment for adjusting the automation. We see roads and we take it for granted, but we had to completely change our external nature, which is the earth, and make roads for us to drive a car. So for a lot of the robotics and automated equipments, you have to completely change your nature and surrounding versus humans just, for hundreds and thousands of years just went through jungles and cut things as they go. So the tacit knowledge for some of the jobs that require movement and, dexterity and so on would be protected for quite a bit of time.
I'm just going to add a brief piece to this because I think you guys nailed both of them. When you think about businesses that typically don't deal with data, and then also the question is, how is AI disrupting construction? To your point, there's a lot of pieces of AI. So is it generative AI? If that's the question that they're asking, is how is generative AI, disrupting the construction industry? That's very different than how, the automation AI piece. And so, you really have to drill down to those pieces where, in construction, you're looking at analytics. I have friends that have a construction business, and they're looking at trends of where are they building, how are they building, what's a better way to build, and using AI, generative AI, to analyze data. So there are pieces that are getting used, but it depends on what the question is.
All right, well, why don't we try to go to a question here? Is there anybody in the room that has a question they'd like to ask?
Just to start, I have a question that two of us actually had, so I'm thinking a few people may have it in the room, and then we can ask another question. But am I on the microphone? Okay. Anyway, so Will had mentioned previously, I think, something that makes a lot of sense, and that's the idea that we shouldn't regulate the technology, but regulate the use of the technology. But if you think about it, most of the things that we're worried about, AI doing, there are laws. If a person did those things, there would be laws against those things like discrimination. And so I just have a question for everybody, and this is a question that two of us at least shared, and that's, so do we need any regulation of AI at all, or can we just say that any regulation that applies to a human also applies to AI?
So in part, I don't think that as a first hash of the problem, I don't think that's wrong, which to say very, very clearly that the question is how do we apply old principles to new problems? That is something that at least I try to suggest in my presentation, that effectively, right, that we have these old ideas of, say, property rights, of consumer protection, of civil rights law, that the interesting thing will be as how do those apply in the new circumstances when it interacts with AI systems. And a lot of that has been effectively dealt with, I would say. The areas where we could see or potentially would want to understand better what's actually going on would potentially be transparency, right? These large systems exist, and we kind of have a good sense of what's going on, but perhaps something that's mandated that everyone has to tell us what's going on in the back end. Broadly speaking, sometimes, for example, Grok, it's interesting, but they don't do what are called they don't do what are called system cards, or they're inconsistent with what they're telling people. So I think that there could be some very narrow ways in which we would actually want legislation. But broadly speaking, I think you're exactly right. In the sense that a lot of the current laws that we have are going to solve a lot of the problems in the near term that people think that that exists with these systems. There's also this really interesting thing that's happening, which we kind of didn't mention too much about it, but child safety, broadly speaking, is this very interesting sort of tension that's going on right now, which is that we have character AI, which is a chat bot, right? It was bot. And what's going to be interesting to see is how all of these, there's a question about kids' mental health and how that integrates with chatbot systems. That could be another area where you do see work in legislative action. I think what's an interesting part, again, of that is that character AI has basically anyone that's under 18, they've kicked off their platform. And it seems also that there was a recent Wired report that all of the major chatbot companies got together in Stanford, and they've been talking with Stanford, so they may release something proactively. That I think is a very interesting. We just haven't seen that proactive sense, and this has also been interesting with with Microsoft and your guys' relationship with OpenAI and with Anthropic. A whole bunch of these companies are being very proactive because they do see the fact that they don't want to be in the same place as social media and privacy law, and they do want to be able to have a clear pathway. They don't want to be in the same realm as we were in 2018 or 2016, right, when we started proposing privacy laws, and then you had to change your entire flow and patterns. So I think that what we're seeing is this proactive sense of being, we want to be good players. Not to say that also the social media platforms weren't good players, but I think it's just a different context and a different situation. And I think it's also much easier considering the product itself. But there are these little things that, well, not little things by any means, but I think that the major areas we'll probably see some action would be in transparency and then child safety, broadly speaking.
Anybody else? So I'll throw out just a quick framework as a way to maybe think about this, and maybe this will also trigger other people to jump in. You have kind of three different areas, right? You have the stuff that is AI specific, like some of the stuff you mentioned with like child protection, where we don't really have that issue. I mean, some people would argue that we have the issue, but you're not going to stop one 10-year-old talking to another 10-year-old about anything. They're in an equal place. But when you have a 10-year-old talking to an AI, the AI has got more world experience, quote unquote, than it is. So you have that kind of framework. You have a lot of areas that are covered by existing laws, but there are some of those existing laws that may be very specific to a human. So if there's a law that says a human shall not kill another human, and we don't want AIs murdering people, that may be a law that we need to change to make it more general. And then the third thing is the areas where we have something that's kind of falling in the cracks, where it just doesn't fit nicely into those categories. So I don't know if that triggers anybody else, or if we've got any other thoughts.
No, I think that's exactly correct. And I think the last two categories you mentioned are actually pretty close to each other, right? That the question of the stuff in the gaps, right? There is this other question about radiologists, right? Revana was talking about radiologists. The interesting thing is that when you actually ask a lot of doctors about this question, one of the reasons why you don't have radiologists, right, there's two, I'm actually working on a paper on this to try to pull together as much as possible, but understanding where the current regulatory system basically creates these fractures, right? Radiologists are interesting and doctors are interesting for two separate related problems. One of them is that oftentimes CMS, right, that CMS won't pay for the pricing of the high quality AI system. So even if you do have a better system that it's an AI system, the government's not going to pay for it. Insurance is not going to accept it. So cool. It's just never going to get deployed in the market, right? So even if something is legal, whether or not it actually fits within the pricing structure of basically the medicine system, I think is one really, really interesting and important caveat. Another kind of related problem is kind of related also to radiologists, which is, if you've got an AI system and your AI system conflicts with your standard of care, which if you ever get sued, right, like a doctor, I believe it's a technical term, a standard of care or duty of, it is a duty of care, but it's basically like, if you ever get sued, you have to basically suggest, well, what I was doing was something that everyone else is doing. And so it creates this interesting sort of liability problem when you're talking about AI systems, because if your AI system provides you with information that's better, but it's in conflict with what everyone everyone is typically doing in that system, that it is easier for you to just say, well, I'm going to follow what everyone else is doing, because therefore I'm always going to be basically covered through my liability, as compared to using an AI system which may conflict with the standard of care, even though it's better than what everyone else is agreeing to. And in fact, this has created a very interesting sort of liability problem. It's very, 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 very wonky. But when you talk to doctors, you should actually ask them this question about liability, how they understand liability within AI systems, because that conflict oftentimes comes about. My cousin is a pediatrician, and I was actually asking her this exact problem, and she's like, oh yeah, that's something that a lot of people think about, and because of it, we just don't really use a lot of those systems, or if we do, like, we just kind of don't really listen to them. And when you look at surveys, that's actually what you find.
So I want to go back to another, did anybody else have anything else? All right. And if not, then I want to go back to another online question here. So we had a question from somebody online. What is the most effective way to address the AI challenge, AI generally, in the education system? They mentioned both K-12 and higher ed, with a focus on allowing learners to be productive in this new AI world. And I think, Taya, you kind of spoke to that a little bit with what you were telling your nieces and your nephews, but maybe are there any specific recommendations, specific thoughts that any of our panelists might have specifically related to the educational systems?
Yes. Microsoft has done quite a bit of work in a few different areas. We launched some AI skilling in Washington State a few years ago. And it was quite interesting because it was using different regional teaching groups to kind of do train the trainer. So there's 9 different organizations, regional organizations within the Washington State system. They were doing train the trainer for each of those 9 systems, and then that train the trainer would then go back to that school or school district within their region to do more train the training and so forth. And it was all about AI. It was about helping teachers to utilize AI in order to do, curriculum advancement and planning, helping to teach teachers how to use AI, but then also help teach teachers to teach AI to their students and how to use it. And one thing that came out of that, and that was, like I said, a couple years ago, so it was still kind of early when generative AI started popping on the system, and you had people who weren't used to using it, especially school board members, that were quite fearful of it. And so there were some school boards that shut down the program because they just didn't want AI in the education system, period. They didn't really want to learn about it. They didn't really want to understand, they just were like, it's big, bad, scary, so no. So we kind of did a little bit of, reevaluation on what going to schools looks like and how do we approach that. And the fear of the unknown is very, very powerful. And so being able to have those conversations about why AI is good and why, and embedding that into the training. So when that train the trainer goes to the school board or goes to the superintendent, they're able to start with the why, start with this is why we would like to support students in AI and teachers in AI, and give some just general education to the overall public in order to help that to land within the educational systems. So we've had a lot of learnings throughout the years when we have been doing trainings and when we've been working with different groups on training. And so, that's just, I'll let the other two talk about it, but that's just a piece of what we've learned throughout the years on just how to combat that fear of the unknown.
I don't think I have a lot more to add to this, except for perhaps the technology needs to get to the direction of not using just ChatGPT or Claude the way it's available, but more customized to a specific school and district, and public-private partnership is exactly what we need. And obviously with ChatGPT, you now are able to build your own AI in your own personal computer, that they made it publicly available. So I think the first part would be to public education and inform teachers and collaborate to create specific tools for specific school, for specific disciplines. So you're not going out in the wild of ChatGPT. And maybe those are some ways to navigate the fear. But I think what you guys did are exactly the right way to go.
Thank you. And the president of Microsoft, his name is Brad Smith. He wrote a book several years ago called Tools and Weapons. And ultimately, this is before ChatGPT and generative AI hit the scene in November of 2022. But this was a book that strictly talked about how technology can be used as a tool and also as a weapon, and how to view that, and how to become a good consumer of AI in order to make sure that the AI that you're using, or the technology that you're using, is used as a tool and not a weapon. We have a group called Responsible AI in Microsoft. It has been an organization within Microsoft for probably 20, 25 years, looking at how Microsoft tools are just that, a tool, and not used as a weapon. And it has become even more critical with generative AI and all the different fakes that can get produced, to make sure that and biases that can be produced within AI, that we're working on that. And so we talk a lot about that piece of tools and weapons when we're talking about education and helping the educational system to say, yes, we are fully aware that this could cause problems. We are fully aware that you could have a student write their whole entire paper using AI. But you know what? There's also an AI that could review that paper that shows you that they wrote the whole entire thing in AI. So there's just ways of being able to have those conversations and say, okay, being very frank and having that, building that rapport to say, yes, we are Microsoft. We have put a lot of energy into AI. However, a lot of that energy has also been in using it responsibly. And so we're going to help you do that. And these are the ways that we're going to help you do that. And that's with everybody. I mean, I think that's anybody who's creating products around AI. We've been collaborating with a lot of other groups too, to make sure that that is just the general feeling that this is we understand that this could be a weapon, but we're also really invested in making it a tool.
Real quick, just a couple additions here. One thing I would say, I think the mileage depends on your industry, right, and your educational opportunities. Engineers, especially, I've been seeing them go much more towards like the blue book thing, right, where you have in-class tests, you have a lot more numbers, whereas some of the people that I know that work in rhetoric and in political science, they are just much more explicit about their use, and they are bringing it within the classroom, understanding it, but then also critiquing themselves and understanding the outputs. So I think that we're seeing both ways, right? One way, which is just going kind of old school and just doing things through, root memorization and through the kind of like the ways that a lot of people had learned, and then through very, very explicit means on the other end, right, through saying, hey, this is what the output was, here's where I think it was wrong. And I think that it really just depends on the industry and the kind of educational space that you're in. The other part of this is, I'll be very honest, that basically, we're only now just getting understandings about labor market and how these things are affecting productivity. We really have almost no understanding of how ChatGPT affects, or LLMs affect, educational outcomes. It's just like it's a black box right now. I think there's only one or two really good papers, and I saw one of them literally come through yesterday, and I haven't really read through it, but I know that was literally November. So experiments, pure experiments, I think this is actually a huge space, especially if you're a graduate student or you're a researcher. Having something that is actually clearly defined as an experiment within a study, right? You should definitely do it, because now is the time to do it, because there just is, we have very little knowledge about what's going on within the educational space.
I love that you brought up blue books. You gave me a little stress after thinking about all the blue books that I had to go through in college. You guys know what blue books are? Maybe? No? Yeah, it's like, ooh, boy, you brought me back. So
Well, not to worry, we're going to do the quiz right now. So everybody get your blue book out. I want to go to another question from the audience here, but before we completely leave education, I did want to give you each an opportunity to say whether you kind of feel like what we're doing in formal education and informal education is meeting the mark, or are we a ways off from the mark? What do we need to do to hit the mark if you don't think we're meeting it? But we'll try to go quickly so we can jump to the audience and try to get at least another question or two before we wrap up.
No. More than that?
That was quick.
Yes and no, I should say. There's a lot of steps that are being taken. And as I said before, I think there could be a lot more embedding AI and technology principles within curriculum. I know it's hard. I know it probably doesn't always marry well with other pieces, but I think also training educators to understand how to do that is going to be critical. There's just more room there.
I think the impacts are probably very heterogeneous across the country and different countries. So as I previously, during my presentation, I was sharing that my grad school was in Europe and my undergrad, my work is here in East Coast. And in certain universities in Europe, there is a lot of pushback. We don't want to use it altogether. This is going to take away your methods of learning. Even in economics, even at advanced learning stage, some professors strictly said you are not allowed to use it altogether. And then I come to my current employer at Mercatus Center, and obviously one of our prominent figures, Tyler Cowan, is very pro-technology. And we were told to just use as much as you can to be the most productive version of yourself. So I think this will depend on the culture of that region, of how people are, how they feel about technology. And this is not K-12, and this is more with university, and we're all aware of this misalignment of incentives, is that the way our professorship and tenure track works, that more is related to research. And so much, I have had so many amazing professors, but I think they were really great professors because they were really passionate about teaching. But we also have had professors who were like, I'm just teaching because I have to, I would rather do research. And so at that level, there is mismatch of what we are learning in universities and what the labor market is demanding as soon as you get out. And you hear from so many students over and over again that, oh, the things I learned in college, my core modules, this module, and spend all this money is not matching with what I am studying, what I need to do for my job. This is a long point I'm trying to make, but I think there is an incentive misalignment in our higher education of how people are trained and their trainers' incentive. And I'm very nervous as I'm making this point at a university, but that's my thoughts are.
And real quick, I think the problem's more endemic and they stretch further back than just what's happening with ChatGPT. I mean, you know, when I was in grad school, I think I was in the very, very tail end of an older generation of grad school. And one of the things that was really surprising now is just the fact that, you know, having taught at two different experiences in two different places, students no longer, I mean, last time I was teaching as a research with research assistants, they basically were no longer doing the reading in a way that 10 years beforehand, it was just like that just was not the case. That's the thing I really worry about right now. I think it's not enough people do the reading and not enough people are doing the work. I think that's just a more endemic problem. There's a huge issue with grade inflation, with being able to do the math, but I think that's just much, much more endemic than just what's going on with AI.
All right, if the microphone decides to let us, let's go to the question from the audience.
Right, Will. I'm going to go back to the regulation. The CEO of Anthropic came out on 60 Minutes last week and said he is very, very uncomfortable with no regulation, and that who the heck who voted for them, him and Sam Altman, to create all these models. And he says because these models are going to be destructive in the end. And this is a guy who is creating these models. And that leads me to my second question. This morning, my son and I, my family, were watching news while they're eating breakfast, and I'm watching the news, and Elon Musk says 20 years from now, we're not going to have any jobs. And these are the guys with big egos. This is what they want. I mean, when he's telling me that, I'm saying he wants to be the king of the world. He's seeing himself as, I'm going to create this technology, I'm going to control it. And this is what I'm telling you right now. My son, class of 2036, 7 years old, says, why are we going to school? We're not going to have any jobs, right? So what do I tell him? You know, because if these guys, this is their goal, right? He is telling me that my goal, he's saying it's going to happen, but he's telling me that my goal of developing this technology, this is the reason why I'm fighting with OpenAI, because I want to have that technology to get to my own goal. I don't want some outman to get there. I mean, that's what I hear when he says stuff like that. What do you guys say to that? And I know we've said, well, it's not going to take our jobs, but my son he's saying 10 to 20 years from now, my son is saying 10 years from now, I don't need to why am I studying this when I'm not going to have a job? They're just going to give me free money, and that's what he's.
I mean, I want free money too. That'd be
Yeah.
great.
I don't have
Son, 7-year-old,
Yeah.
greatest mind ever.
Well, I mean, but that's what he was told by
By
the
Elon.
richest man in the world.
So-
So with the regulation, my car just started driving crazy. It has a Mad Max mode, and it's going 20 miles per hour. And I'm saying this is illegal. The car should not be driving itself and doing this, going in and out of traffic.
Yeah, you know what's
So-
funny about all this is Elon in 2015 said that we were going to have fully autonomous taxis by 2020, and his system has yet to create it. And he thought that he would completely change things fundamentally by 2020, 2021. He made this prediction. You can actually look online. I'd highly suggest it with Wikipedia. I think that a lot of people who work in this space make very, very, very bold predictions. And I do know that people are working on these systems. There's a lot of other people on very, very opposite sides who think, Omodi over at Anthropic literally said in 5-10 years, we're going to have complete displacement of 50% of all jobs. Now, the interesting thing is that this prediction was made quite literally in 2013, in 2014, in 2015. This is actually how I kind of mentioned it, but this is originally how I got involved in this in the space of AI, which is understanding the nature of the predictions. The longer term trend is very, very clear, right? As long as people are getting richer fundamentally, then you're going to have continual growth of jobs. And that's the real thing that I think we need to focus on. This is Autor was mentioned in Revana's work. He's done a lot of really, really interesting work on this. You look at long-term trends. And there is the other thing very much to check out is what's called the Baumol effect, which is that as things get easier and more productive in one side of the economy, basically the things that are harder to produce, particularly service jobs, you have more demand for that. And so one of the unfortunate side effects is that sometimes you actually get inflation in that, or you get increases in prices in those areas. But we've seen this trend change over time. Broadly, what I would say to your son is, one, to focus on core skills, right? Coordination, understanding, being, looking at the world and trying to be curious about the world. Knowing that jobs will still exist. I think that to think that jobs are going to be fundamentally gone. I mean, we've made this prediction. We made this prediction for generations and generations. Keynes actually, John Keynes, the great economist, suggested that once people, that effectively right now people should only work something like 15 hours a week, and yet people aren't, right? They're working 35 hours a week. But again, when you look at the long sweep of history, the number of hours have gone down. People are enjoying, they have typically, in spite of some of the issues here in the United States, they typically do have longer vacations. There's a whole bunch of really positive benefits to the economy, and we've seen a lot of really good trends over the long term. What I would say is, you do need to focus on these things. You need to focus on being able to learn. That's actually one of the more important things we see with education, is that the ability to learn is in fact one of the big values of going to college, right? That you can show people that you're willing to be dedicated to long-term tasks, like that your pure knowledge that comes from education and from graduate school or undergraduate is basically completely swamped in a lot of industries by your ability to signal that you can learn, that you can do a long-term project, that you can be dedicated to something. So I think those are the things that you should be focused on. Happy to talk about it more. I'll just be honest. I mean, when you hear Altman and you hear Elon Musk talking about this and Modi talking about this, that we're going to have no jobs in 5 or 10 years. I'm just skeptical because we heard this before and all the signs don't really suggest it yet. You would look for a whole bunch of things in the economy that are happening and yet they're not happening right now. Not to say that they couldn't potentially happen, but the long-term structural kind of forces that exist in our economy, they're constantly searching for that. And as long as we maintain a dynamic economy, there will be more jobs that exist in the future. And jobs that didn't exist, right? Like people are talking about getting rid of marketing jobs and like SEO jobs, search engine optimization jobs, right? Some of those are going away. That probably is going away. That stuff didn't exist in 2006, right? I remember quite literally when I was an undergraduate, some guy came in and told me about this new job, which was social media marketing. And that was just unheard of at that time. These things are continually dynamic. And as long as we allow for the dynamism to exist in the economy, which we do have to be attendant to, as long as we allow for that dynamism, I don't think there's a long-term problem.
With some of the founders, and there is the little bit of mismatch you see between the technologists and the economists when they're looking at how this technology is being deployed and how it's affecting everyone's job. And obviously, some folks genuinely are worried. I don't want to say everybody's, but you have to wonder a little bit of the motivational reasoning of that, and then fundraising aspect of how these technology companies gain funds and deploy new technologies. It's actually in their interest to really make these big claims. But I'm not trying to say everybody's doing that. Some people are genuinely worried. So you have to think about the motivational reasoning aspect of that a little bit. I mean, I think in the 60s and 70s, we already had those movies of flying cars, right? I don't see the flying cars here yet. But so some of the breakthroughs happen and some others didn't. And I'm just imagining a 7-8-year-old, like, what do you tell them? You tell them you create new jobs, you create a new type of world. You imagine. I think they're really good at imagining at that age.
So unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I want to give each member of the panel a minute. Maybe we could try to keep this quick again. What are kind of the key takeaways, final thoughts? What would you like people to take away from this panel, from what, for our folks that spoke earlier in the day, from your presentations, from this panel, et cetera? Maybe we'll just, whoever wants to go first.
I would say just be curious. Teach others to be curious, ask good questions. When it comes to AI, I mean, you can ask Copilot good questions if you want. But yeah, I think when it comes to AI, be curious, ask questions, and don't let the fear of the unknown, take a hold of you or be too powerful in your life.
Do the readings. That's all you have to do. There's so much alpha in actually reading the prime material, whether it's a law, whether it's a model, whether it's a paper, just do the readings.
I think you can pick and choose. Like previously, we had to, every jobs, even if it's our job that we're passionate about, I mentioned this earlier, from theoretical economic point of view, jobs are bundles of tasks. And we know in all of our jobs, certain tasks we hate, certain tasks we really like, we're passionate about, and our identity and self-worth and value in community are tied to those little tasks. So maybe the task you hate, try to be as lazy as you can with those tasks and automate it. And the things that you're really passionate about, just protect those and really, pour all your heart and soul on those. I think then it's a win-win.
All right, well, let's give a quick round of applause and thank our panelists. So before we wrap up, I want to thank everybody for attending this event. We were just talking out during the lunch break about how long we've been doing this for, and we think this may be the 5th one, I think was where we ended up. Is that right, John? 5th, okay. So, again, I mean, AI has changed so dramatically in that time. We had a really great audience this morning of, we think about 80 or 90 people in here, at least 35 on Zoom, because I know there were 35 on Zoom at one time, probably a few more that came and left. So a lot of interest in this, a lot of change, but again, also a lot of kind of similar themes about perhaps not needing to regulate just for the purpose of regulating, about how AI can actually tie in to making humanity a better world for humanity, making it so humanity can actually flourish, which are really some of the Challey Institute's key themes and goals and areas to explore. So again, thanks everybody for coming today, and I'll turn it back over to John for some last words.
So I'm not going to be able to offer a lot of wisdom after that. Jeremy did a nice job of wrapping it up. But again, I think I know we had two great presentations this morning. So, Revana, thank you for presenting and helping us to understand the labor implications better. And Will, thank you for helping us understand the regulatory aspects of AI as well. And then Taya, this is a great panel too. I love your message about just don't be afraid of AI and let's figure out how to use it, especially you think about it at a university. And I think a lot of professors are kind of afraid of AI. They're like, we're just gonna not let anybody use AI. Well, you can't do that. I mean, because we know that eventually that our students are gonna be out there in the workplace are gonna be at a big disadvantage if we say, well, you just can't be exposed to any AI, and then you'll just be exposed when you get out in the workplace and you'll be at a big disadvantage against everyone else. And so I love the idea of let's figure out how we can use it. And I'm really excited about the prospects for the future. I think that the overall tone, I mean, hopefully everyone else feels this way. I always feel optimistic, but I'm super optimistic about our future and especially with AI and the great people who are leading us in this, understanding this. So thanks everyone for being here and hope to see you at our next event. So thanks a lot.